It began with the sound of engines long before anyone could see what was coming, a low, rolling thunder spreading across the steppe, carried by heat, dust, and expectation. Prokhorovka was not meant to be legendary. It was a railway station, a scattering of fields and low ground beneath an open sky. But in the summer of 1943, it became the place where two immense forces collided at point-blank range, where planning dissolved into instinct, and where the war in the East reached a kind of violent clarity that could never be undone. By this point in the war, nothing was abstract anymore. Everyone knew the stakes. Everyone knew the cost. Everyone knew there would be no easy outcome. The German offensive aimed at the Kursk salient had already begun to grind down under layers of Soviet defense. Progress was slow, losses were heavy, and yet German armored forces pushed on, believing that one decisive blow could still break the balance. South of Kursk, that belief narrowed toward a single point, Prokhorovka. The Soviets were waiting, not reacting, not improvising. Waiting. Entire armored formations had been held back for this moment. Crews were briefed, engines warmed, orders simplified to their most brutal truth. Close the distance and destroy the enemy before firepower and precision could be brought fully to bear. It was not elegant. It was necessary. When the battle erupted, it did so all at once. Tanks surged forward through dust and smoke, so thick that visibility collapsed to mere meters. Long-range gunnery became impossible. Radios failed. Orders vanished into noise. Steel met steel at distances where reaction time mattered more than doctrine. Vehicles rammed one another, turrets jammed, crews fired, until ammunition ran out or the machine itself stopped moving. The ground shook continuously. Explosions overlapped until there was no silence between them. The air filled with smoke, burning fuel, and the metallic taste of destruction. The sun disappeared behind dust clouds, kicked up by hundreds of moving machines. This was not maneuver warfare. This was collision. German armor, designed for precision and range, found itself dragged into a fight where those advantages dissolved. Soviet tanks pressed in relentlessly, accepting losses to deny space. Every destroyed vehicle became an obstacle. Every wreck tightened the battlefield further. The field around Prokhorovka turned into a graveyard of twisted metal and fire. For the men inside those tanks, time lost meaning. There was only forward or stop, fire or be fired upon, move or burn. The fighting raged for hours, then for what felt like forever. Neither side achieved a clean breakthrough. Neither side escaped without staggering loss. But when the dust finally began to settle, one truth became unavoidable. The German offensive had spent its last reserve of momentum. What remained was exhaustion, damage, and the realization that even elite armored forces could be ground down when space, time, and surprise were denied. The Soviets, despite horrific losses, had achieved what they needed most. They stopped the advance, absorbed the blow, and held long enough to unleash counteroffensives elsewhere. Prokhorovka did not end the Battle of Kursk by itself, but it ended the illusion that Germany could still force a decision in the East through armored assault alone. From this point forward, the war would move in one direction, sometimes slowly, sometimes at terrible cost, but without returning to what came before. Prokhorovka stands as a symbol, not because it was clean or decisive, but because it was raw. It shows what happens when preparation meets desperation, when planning collides with reality, and when the outcome of a campaign is decided not by elegance, but by endurance. Tonight, we return to that field, to the dust and fire, to the moment when distance vanished and the future of the war closed in to a few chaotic hours, to Prokhorovka, where the war in the East revealed its true shape. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening closely, if these long, unhurried journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or escape the constant rush of the present, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this space one story at a time, carefully, thoughtfully, and without turning history into noise. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel. You're helping keep this kind of calm, immersive storytelling alive. Settle in. This is the history of the Battle of Prokhorovka, The spring mud of 1943 stretched across the Russian steppe like a brown ocean, swallowing roads and turning forests into islands of skeletal birch trees. In a cramped room at the Kremlin on the 15th of March, 3 Soviet mapmakers stood before a wall-sized chart of the Eastern Front, their fingers tracing a bulge that protruded westward into German-held territory, like an infected wound. The Kursk salient measured 250 kilometers from north to south, 150 kilometers deep, and contained over 1,300,000 Soviet troops who had pushed the Germans back during the winter counteroffensive. One mapmaker, a colonel whose name has been lost to history, placed a red circle around the bulge and spoke words that would prove prophetic. The Germans will never be able to resist this. He was right, but not in the way anyone in that room imagined. The salient was both a triumph and a trap. Soviet forces had recaptured Kursk in February, after months of brutal winter fighting, creating this massive westward projection into German lines that disrupted the entire front. To German commanders studying their own maps hundreds of kilometers away, the bulge represented an irresistible operational opportunity, a chance to encircle and destroy an entire Soviet army group in a single massive pincer movement. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps Germany's most talented operational commander, saw it as a chance to regain the initiative lost at Stalingrad. General Walther Model, commanding the Ninth Army in the north, saw it as a necessary amputation of a dangerous Soviet penetration. Adolf Hitler saw it as a propaganda victory that could restore German prestige after the catastrophe on the Volga. What none of them fully grasped was that Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning so deeply that every division they moved, every tank they concentrated, every supply dump they established was being reported to Moscow within days. On the 15th of April, 1943, Hitler convened a conference at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden to finalize plans for Operation Citadel, the assault on the Kursk salient. The meeting revealed the deep divisions among German leadership about whether to attack at all. Manstein argued for an immediate offensive in late April or early May, before the Soviets could fortify further, using the element of surprise and the muddy season's end to achieve breakthrough. Model countered that his forces needed more time to receive the new Panther and Tiger tanks that would give them technological superiority over Soviet armor. Heinz Guderian, the Inspector General of Armored Troops, argued against Citadel entirely, wanting to preserve Germany's rebuilt panzer forces for defensive operations in the West, where the Allies were clearly preparing an invasion. Hitler wavered, postponed, reconvened, and postponed again. Every day of delay gave the Soviets another 24 hours to dig trenches, lay mines, and bring up reserves. By May of 1943, the Kursk salient had become the most heavily fortified piece of ground on Earth. Soviet commanders Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky had convinced Stalin to adopt a revolutionary strategy. Let the Germans attack first, bleed them on prepared defenses, then counterattack with fresh reserves when German strength was exhausted. This concept of deliberate defense was a dramatic departure from Stalin's usual insistence on immediate offensive action. The dictator had learned, painfully and at the cost of millions of lives, that Soviet forces needed time to prepare, and that German operational skill often turned hasty Soviet attacks into encirclement disasters. Intelligence from the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, from the British ultra-decryption program, and from Soviet agents inside the German command structure provided unprecedented detail about German plans. The Soviets knew not just that an attack was coming, but when, where, and with which units. The defensive preparations were staggering in scale. Soviet engineers and infantry dug 6,000 kilometers of trenches, enough to stretch from Moscow to New York City if laid end to end. They constructed 8 successive defensive belts, each between 5 and 10 kilometers deep, creating a zone of fortifications that extended 50 kilometers behind the front line. They laid 400,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, creating density that approached 1,500 mines per kilometer of front in the most critical sectors. They brought forward 10,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers, more guns than had been concentrated in any single operation in history. They positioned 6,000 tanks, most dug into hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed, creating mobile strongpoints that could shift to threatened sectors. the 1st Tank Army and 5th Guards Tank Army were held in reserve, ready to counterattack any German breakthrough. The Germans, meanwhile, were assembling their own massive force, but with critical weaknesses masked by impressive statistics. 900,000 men would participate in Citadel, supported by 2,700 tanks and assault guns, a formidable armored force that included 240 Tigers and 200 Panthers, the newest and most powerful tanks in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. 10,000 artillery pieces would support the offensive. The Luftwaffe concentrated 2,500 aircraft, the largest German air concentration since the Battle of Britain 3 years earlier. On paper, the attack force looked overwhelming. In reality, it was a brittle instrument. The delay until July to wait for more Panthers meant the Soviets had transformed the Salient into a fortress. The new tanks, rushed into production to meet Hitler's deadline, were mechanically unreliable. Panthers averaged 150 kilometers before major mechanical failure. Perhaps most critically, German intelligence had completely failed to identify the full scope of Soviet defensive preparations or the presence of powerful reserve armies. On the 4th of July, 1943, German commanders held their final briefings at forward headquarters in Kharkov. The mood mixed confidence and unease in equal measure. Junior officers showed their troops aerial reconnaissance photographs of Soviet positions, pointing out the trenches and tank obstacles visible from above, assuring the men that German firepower would pulverize these defenses. Tank crews performed final maintenance on their vehicles, Tiger and Panther crews taking special pride in their superior armor and guns. The plan called for simultaneous attacks from north and south to pincer off the salient, with Army Group Center's 9th Army driving south, while Army Group South's 4th Panzer Army drove north, meeting somewhere near Kursk to trap the Soviet forces inside. The northern force under Model had 335,000 men and 1,000 tanks. The southern force under Hermann Hoth had 350,000 men and over 1,500 tanks, including the concentrated might of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps with its Tigers and Panthers. What the Germans didn't know would prove fatal to their offensive. Soviet intelligence had provided not just strategic warning, but tactical precision. The exact timing of the German attack, 4:30 a.m. on the 5th of July, reached Soviet headquarters through multiple intelligence channels. This allowed Zhukov to plan something unprecedented, a spoiling attack timed to disrupt German assault formations as they assembled for their own attack. At 3:30 a.m. on July 5th, 2.5 hours before the scheduled German hour, Soviet artillery erupted across the entire front. 8,000 guns and rocket launchers fired a 40-minute barrage on German assembly areas, command posts, and artillery positions identified through signals, intelligence, and aerial reconnaissance. The barrage didn't stop the German attack, but it disrupted communications, destroyed ammunition stocks, and killed or wounded thousands of German soldiers before they even began their advance. When German forces finally attacked at 5 a.m., they were already behind schedule and off balance. The first 2 days of fighting revealed the enormous disparity between German expectations and Soviet reality. German forces made progress, but at catastrophic cost and glacial pace. In the north, Model's 9th Army attacked with 900 tanks and ran directly into a defensive zone that resembled an industrial meat grinder. Anti-tank guns positioned in mutually supporting positions picked off German armor at ranges up to 800 meters. When tanks passed the gun line, they drove into minefields that destroyed tracks and immobilized vehicles, leaving them vulnerable to follow-up artillery fire. Soviet infantry, fighting from deep trenches with interlocking fields of fire, couldn't stop the German advance but made every meter costly. By the end of July 6th, Model's forces had penetrated only 10 kilometers, a third of what the plan projected for the first day, and had lost over 200 tanks. In the south, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under Paul Hauser, achieved better initial results, but even here, the reality diverged sharply from the plan. The Corps' 3 divisions, Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, were the elite of the German military, heavily equipped with Tigers and Panthers, manned by fanatical soldiers who believed themselves invincible. They smashed through the 1st Soviet defensive belt on July 5th and the 2nd belt on July 6th, advancing 20 kilometers in 48 hours. but the losses were mounting in ways that couldn't be sustained. 97 tanks of Leibstandart were destroyed or damaged in the first 2 days. Panthers broke down at alarming rates, their transmissions failing, their engines overheating, their final drives snapping under the stress of combat maneuvering. Soviet defenders, though suffering far higher casualties, were fighting according to plan, trading space and lives for time and German combat power. By July 7th, both German pincer arms were still separated by over 100 kilometers, far short of achieving the encirclement that was Citadel's entire purpose. The salient that had looked so vulnerable on maps in April had become a killing ground. The question was no longer whether the Germans could close the trap, but whether they could sustain the offensive long enough to find out. On a humid morning in June 1943, Lieutenant Karl Rubbel of the Leibstandart Adolf Hitler Division climbed into the turret of his new Tiger I heavy tank at the Grafenwohr proving grounds in Bavaria and experienced what he would later describe as religious awe. The 56-ton monster beneath him represented the pinnacle of German engineering, a massive steel fortress mounting an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at distances exceeding 2,000 meters, protected by armor 100mm thick that no enemy weapon could penetrate at combat ranges. The Tiger's Maybach engine produced 700 horsepower, just barely enough to move the enormous weight at 38 kilometers per hour on roads slower across country. Rubbel's crew spent 3 days learning the tank's systems, practicing loading the 2-piece ammunition, adjusting the precision optics, and most importantly, learning the endless maintenance requirements that kept the complex machine operational. What they didn't know, because the instructors carefully avoided mentioning it, was that only 1,347 Tigers would ever be built, not nearly enough to equip the German armored forces that would face thousands of Soviet tanks. The Panther tank, in contrast, was supposed to be Germany's mass production answer to the Soviet 34. Designed after German commanders encountered 34s in 1941 and realized their Panzer Is and IVs were outmatched, the Panther incorporated sloped armor for better protection, a powerful 75mm long-barreled gun for killing power, and a design intended for production in the thousands. The first production Panthers rolled out of the Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg factory in January 1943, 6 months before Citadel. They looked magnificent, low-slung, purposeful, with graceful sloped armor that deflected shots and a gun that could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. The problem was that they had been rushed into production before the design was mature, before the bugs were worked out, before the testing revealed fundamental flaws. Hitler, obsessed with fielding wonder weapons that would restore German supremacy, had overruled his engineers' warnings and demanded immediate mass production. The result was a weapon that was simultaneously brilliant and fatally flawed. At Grafenwohr in late June, instructors put a company of Panthers through final trials before shipping them to the Eastern Front for Citadel. The trials revealed catastrophe. Engines caught fire spontaneously due to fuel lines routed too close to hot exhaust manifolds. Transmissions failed after 150 kilometers, the final drive shattering under torque loads the designers hadn't anticipated. Road wheels cracked on rough terrain. The tanks broke down more often than they completed training exercises. Mechanics worked 18-hour days trying to fix recurring problems, replacing parts that failed and were replaced again. Tank commanders filed report after report documenting mechanical failures, but the schedule for Citadel was inflexible. Hitler wanted Panthers at Kursk, so Panthers would go to Kursk regardless of their readiness. By the 1st of July, 200 Panthers had been shipped to 2nd SS Panzer Corps, and 70 of them were already non-operational before a shot was fired in anger. The Ferdinand tank destroyer represented German engineering, taken to an absurd extreme. Ferdinand Porsche, the famous designer, had competed to produce the Tiger tank and lost to Henschel's design. Rather than waste the 90 hulls already built to his specifications, the vehicles were converted into tank destroyers, mounting the same 88mm gun as the Tiger, but in a fixed superstructure rather than a rotating turret. The result was a 65-ton behemoth with phenomenal firepower and protection, but a glaring vulnerability: it had no machine gun for close defense. The designers assumed the Ferdinands would operate at long range, destroying enemy tanks before they could close, and that infantry would protect them from close assault. This assumption would prove disastrously wrong in the close quarters fighting around Soviet defensive positions. 200 Ferdinands were concentrated in the north for Model's offensive, and their crews trained intensively on gunnery but not on combined arms tactics that might have compensated for the design flaw. The men who would crew these steel monsters arrived at their units in late June and early July with a mixture of confidence and apprehension. Oberst Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, commanding a panzer regiment in Grossdeutschland Division, briefed his officers on July 4th with maps showing the planned advance route 60 kilometers to Kursk in 3 days, then wheeling east to complete the encirclement. His Tiger and Panther companies would lead the breakthrough, using their superior armor and guns to smash Soviet positions that conventional Panzer ADs and IVs couldn't crack. The plan looked elegant on paper, arrows sweeping across the map, resistance crumbling before superior technology. Strachwitz, a veteran of Poland, France, and 2 years of fighting in Russia, was less optimistic than his superiors. He had seen too many perfect plans dissolve in the reality of combat, too many wonder weapons that failed at the critical moment. The confidence German crews felt in their vehicles came from comparative testing that showed dramatic superiority over known Soviet tanks. A Tiger crew at Grafenwöhr had fired at a captured 34 at 2,000 meters and punched through the armor with the first shot. A Panther had destroyed a 34 at 1,500 meters, the round penetrating the frontal armor and detonating the ammunition, blowing the turret completely off the hull. Soviet anti-tank guns, the 45mm and even the newer 76mm, couldn't penetrate Tiger frontal armor at any combat range, and needed to hit Panthers from the side or rear to achieve kills. This created a sense among German crews that they were invulnerable, that Soviet tankers would flee rather than face Tigers and Panthers in combat. What they didn't consider was that technological superiority means nothing if your tank breaks down before reaching the battlefield, or if you're outnumbered 10-1, or if the enemy refuses to fight the way you expect. The production numbers told a story German propaganda carefully obscured. In 1943, Germany would produce approximately 6,000 tanks and assault guns total, including all types from light reconnaissance vehicles to heavy Tigers. The Soviet Union would produce 24,000 tanks in the same year, a 4-to-1 advantage. Moreover, Soviet production was accelerating while German production remained relatively flat due to Allied bombing of factories and raw material shortages. The Soviets had solved their quality problems from 1941. The 34 was now a mature, reliable design produced in massive numbers by factories that had been evacuated east of the Urals beyond Luftwaffe range. Soviet crews were better trained than in the war's first years, many now veterans with combat experience. The Germans were betting that 200 Tigers and 200 Panthers could offset thousands of 34s, but that bet required the new tanks to be mechanically reliable and tactically invulnerable. Neither assumption would survive contact with reality. On the night of July 4th, mechanics of 2nd SS Panzer Corps worked frantically to repair Panthers that had broken down during the approach march to the front. Engines were pulled and replaced. Transmissions that had seized were rebuilt. Final drives that had cracked were swapped out with spares that themselves might last only a few more kilometers. The maintenance crews, exhausted from weeks of 18-hour days, performed miracles of improvised engineering to get tanks operational. By dawn on July 5th, they had achieved the impossible, bringing the operational rate up to 65%, getting 130 of 200 Panthers ready to attack. But everyone knew this was temporary, that the mechanical gremlins would return as soon as the tanks entered combat, that the maintenance burden would only increase as wear accumulated. The Tiger companies were in better shape mechanically, the design was more mature, the production quality higher, but there simply weren't enough Tigers to matter strategically. The psychology of the German tankers on the eve of Citadel reflected the contradictions of their situation. They believed with considerable justification that their tanks were individually superior to anything the Soviets fielded. They trusted, because their training emphasized it constantly, that quality would overcome quantity. They assumed, because their experience in 1941 and 42 suggested it, that Soviet troops would break when faced with determined assault by elite German units. Yet, underneath the confidence ran currents of doubt. Veterans remembered the 34s they'd encountered in shock in 1941, the seemingly endless Soviet reserves. The way destroyed Soviet units reappeared weeks later, with new equipment and men. They noticed the delays to Citadel, the way the offensive that was supposed to start in May had been postponed to June and then July. They saw the minefields visible in aerial photographs, the defensive positions that grew deeper and more elaborate with each reconnaissance flight. Some, the ones who would survive the battle, later admitted they had a premonition that Citadel was starting too late, against an enemy too well prepared, with weapons too untested. But armies don't run on premonitions, and at 5 a.m. on July 5th, the Steel Cats went to war. The irony that would become apparent only in hindsight was that Germany's technological gamble might have worked if executed differently. If the Panthers had been given 6 more months of development to fix their mechanical problems, if the Tigers had been produced in larger numbers, if the offensive had started in late April as Manstein wanted before Soviet defenses were complete, the superior German tanks might have achieved the breakthrough Citadel required. But Hitler's interference, demanding production before development was complete, delaying the offensive to get more new tanks, then scattering those tanks across multiple offensive sectors, instead of concentrating them, ensured that technological superiority would be squandered. The Steel Cats were magnificent machines, but they were going into battle half-ready, undermanned numerically, and against an enemy who had spent 2 months preparing specifically to defeat them. The question wasn't whether German technology was superior. It was, but whether superiority mattered when the operational and strategic context negated its advantages. On the 28th of June, 1943, Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov received a summons to Voronezh Front Headquarters that would change his life and alter the course of the war. The commander of 5th Guards Tank Army, Rotmistrov, was 48 years old, a veteran of the Russian Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and 2 years of fighting against Germany. He had survived Stalin's purges of the Red Army in 1937, when thousands of officers were executed on fabricated charges of treason, and he had rebuilt shattered tank formations after the catastrophic losses of 1941, when the Germans destroyed over 20,000 Soviet tanks in 6 months. Now he commanded one of the Red Army's elite formations, 850 tanks organized in 3 corps, held in reserve as part of the Steppe Front under Marshal Ivan Konev. The summons from General Nikolai Vatutin, commander of Voronezh Front facing the German forces in the south, was cryptic: prepare for a special assignment, no details provided. The special assignment arrived via secure telephone at 3 a.m. on July 6th, and it came directly from Stalin himself. The dictator's voice on the crackling line was unmistakable, Georgian accent coloring his Russian, tone brooking no discussion or delay. 5th Guards Tank Army would immediately move from its position 380 kilometers southeast of Kursk to Prokhorovka, a small rail junction village northeast of Belgorod. The movement would be conducted in 72 hours, arriving no later than July 9th. The route would follow a single road, movement only at night to avoid Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Radio silence would be absolute, no transmissions that might alert German signals intelligence. Rotmistrov acknowledged the order, hung up the phone, and spent the next hour studying maps with his staff, calculating whether the impossible order was merely incredibly difficult or actually impossible. They concluded it was the former, barely. The challenge was staggering in scope. 850 tanks couldn't simply drive cross-country like cavalry. They needed roads, and the only route from Steppe Front's positions to Prokhorovka, capable of handling heavy armor, was a single dirt road that turned to mud in rain and dust in dry weather. The column of tanks would stretch 300 kilometers longer than the distance they needed to cover, meaning the lead elements would arrive at Prokhorovka while the rear elements were still starting the journey. Fuel consumption for a 34 averaged 280 liters per 100 kilometers, meaning each tank would burn over 1,000 liters for the journey, and the Army would need roughly 1 million liters of fuel delivered at intervals along the route. The logistics staff calculated they would need supply convoys every 100 kilometers, positioned in advance, to refuel the formation on the move. There would be no time for major repairs. Any tank that broke down would be left behind with a skeleton crew to guard it. The composition of 5th Guard's tank army reflected both Soviet strength and the desperate material situation even elite formations faced. Of the 850 tanks, 501 were 34s, the Red Army's main battle tank and the backbone of Soviet armored forces. 264 were T-70 light tanks, fast but lightly armored and armed only with a 45mm gun, inadequate against German medium and heavy tanks. 35 were British Churchill tanks provided through Lend-Lease, heavily armored but painfully slow and mechanically temperamental in Russian conditions. The 34s were generally reliable. The design had matured since early production problems, and Soviet factories were churning them out at a rate of over 1,000 per month. But reliability is relative, and even 34s broke down, especially when driven hard across hundreds of kilometers of primitive roads at night. Rotmistrov's background had prepared him for exactly this kind of crisis. Born in 1895 to a peasant family, he had joined the Red Army during the Civil War and risen through the ranks in the cavalry before transitioning to mechanized forces in the 1930s. He had commanded a tank brigade in Spain, learning from combat against German Condor Legion tactics. He had survived the purges partly through political connections, but mostly through competence. Stalin killed incompetent officers as readily as suspected traitors, and Rotmistrov was undeniably competent. In the disaster of 1941, he had commanded 3rd Mechanized Corps in the border battles, saw his formation destroyed by German air and armor, and rebuilt it from remnants and replacements. By 1943, he understood Soviet armored warfare better than almost anyone, and he understood something more important: he understood Stalin. The order to reach Prokhorovka in 72 hours was not a suggestion or a goal. It was an absolute requirement, and failure would mean court-martial at best, execution at worst. The march began at dawn on July 7th. Rotmistrov's staff had worked through the night, issuing movement orders to each corps, designating march serials, coordinating with front logistics units to position fuel dumps. The first order: absolute noise discipline. Tank engines were started in sequence to avoid concentrated sound that might carry to German reconnaissance positions. The march route avoided any area within 30 kilometers of the front line to minimize chances of observation. Each tank carried maximum internal fuel, plus auxiliary drums strapped to the rear deck, extending range but creating horrific fire hazards if hit. The crews were exhausted before they started. Most had been conducting training exercises and were pulled directly into the march without rest. But exhaustion was irrelevant measured against Stalin's order. The night march presented challenges unforeseen in the planning. Tanks moved with shielded headlights that gave minimal visibility, following the vehicle ahead by watching for its dim rear lights, maintaining 50-meter intervals that accordioned constantly as tanks accelerated and braked. Dust choked drivers and commanders peering from hatches, coating everything in fine powder that got into engines and eyes. The 34's Christie suspension, brilliant for cross-country speed, gave a rough ride on roads, jarring crews constantly over rutted surfaces. Breakdowns started almost immediately: a thrown track here, an overheated engine there, a seized bearing somewhere else. Recovery crews followed the main column, but there wasn't time for major repairs. Tanks that couldn't be fixed in 30 minutes were left behind, crews rejoining the march in support vehicles. On July 8th, disaster nearly struck. Rotmistrov's command tank, a 34 fitted with extra radios, broke down 100 kilometers from Prokhorovka when the transmission failed catastrophically. There were no spares immediately available, no time to await a replacement vehicle. The army commander couldn't wait, the deadline was absolute. Rotmistrov commandeered a motorcycle from a courier, left his staff to follow with the repaired command tank, and rode ahead through the night with only a driver and 2 guards. The motorcycle journey was surreal, racing along a road packed with his own army's tanks, each buttoned up and blind to his passage. Commanders focused on not losing the vehicle ahead in the darkness. He reached Prokhorovka at dawn on July 9th, 12 hours ahead of his lead elements, and his first view of the terrain that would become a battlefield told him everything he needed to know. This would be close quarters fighting, not the open country maneuver warfare Soviet doctrine preferred. The final kilometers of the approach march were conducted in daylight on July 9th, a calculated risk based on the need to position forces before the anticipated German attack. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights spotted the tank columns and reported them to 2nd SS Panzer Corps headquarters, but German intelligence drastically underestimated the numbers. Photo interpreters counted approximately 250 tanks based on visible vehicles, not realizing that Soviet dispersion and camouflage concealed another 400. This intelligence failure would prove catastrophic for German planning. 5th Guards Tank Army arrived at Prokhorovka, having lost 178 tanks to mechanical breakdown during the march, a 21% breakdown rate that was actually better than anticipated. 672 tanks remained operational, and crews collapsed with exhaustion wherever their vehicles halted. Sleeping under armor, they would ride into battle within 48 hours. Rotmistrov's meeting with Vatutin on the morning of July 9th was brief and grim. The Voronezh front commander showed him the map situation. German 2nd SS Panzer Corps was 15 kilometers southwest, driving toward Prokhorovka along multiple axes, pushing back Soviet defensive units that were fighting delaying actions but couldn't stop the German advance. Vatutin's orders were clear. 5th Guards Tank Army would counterattack the German armor before it could break through to the vital Kursk-Belgorod rail line visible from Prokhorovka station. The counterattack would be decisive, either stop the German offensive or die trying. Rotmistrov studied the map, noted the terrain features, calculated the approaches both sides would use. He saw immediately that this would be a meeting engagement, both sides rushing toward the same ground, colliding in close combat, where Soviet numbers might offset German technological superiority. It was the kind of battle Soviet deep battle theory prepared for the decisive commitment of operational reserves at the culminating point of an enemy offensive. Whether the theory would work would be determined in the next 72 hours, and Rotmistrov understood with absolute clarity that his career, his life, and possibly the outcome of the entire Kursk battle depended on those 72 hours. At 3:30 a.m. on July 5, 1943, the eastern horizon lit up with what German soldiers in their assembly positions initially mistook for an early sunrise. 8,000 Soviet guns and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously across 150 kilometers of front, shells screaming overhead in such density that veteran artillerymen later claimed the sound blended into one continuous roar rather than individual explosions. For 40 minutes, the barrage walked across German assembly areas, command posts, artillery positions, and communication centers that Soviet intelligence had identified through weeks of reconnaissance and signals interception. This was Georgy Zhukov's gamble, the spoiling attack based on precise intelligence about German hour, time to disrupt the offensive before it started. The barrage killed approximately 2,000 German soldiers, destroyed dozens of vehicles and guns, and most critically, severed communication lines, just as commanders needed to confirm orders and coordinate the attack. When the fire lifted at 4 to 10 a.m., German forces were shaken, off schedule, and in some sectors, leaderless. The German response came 1 hour and 20 minutes later, delayed from the planned 4:30 hour by the chaos of the Soviet preemptive strike. At 5 a.m., 2nd SS Panzer Corps began its advance north toward Kursk from positions south of Belgorod. The Corps represented the elite of Hitler's armed forces, Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, manned by fanatical volunteers who believed themselves racially and militarily superior to their opponents, equipped with the newest and heaviest armor in the Wehrmacht inventory. The attack formation placed Ferdinands and Tigers in the lead, their massive armor proof against Soviet anti-tank guns, tasked with suppressing defensive positions. Behind them came Panthers and Panzer IVs, exploiting the suppression to break through. Combat engineers accompanied the first wave with mine-clearing equipment, pole charges for bunkers, and flamethrowers for trench systems. The plan called for rapid penetration of the first defensive belt by mid-morning, the second belt by afternoon, achieving a 15-kilometer advance on the first day. Reality diverged from the plan within the first hour. The lead elements of Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division ran into the most sophisticated defensive system German forces had encountered in the war. Soviet engineers had created not just trenches, but an integrated web of positions, where every strong point supported its neighbors with overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank guns were positioned in depth when the first line fired and revealed its positions. German tanks that moved to suppress them ran into fire from second-line guns positioned to cover the first. The guns themselves were camouflaged brilliantly, dug into positions that concealed everything but the barrel, making them almost invisible until they fired. A Leibstandarte Tiger at the village of Berezov engaged what its commander thought was the only anti-tank gun in the sector, destroyed it with an 88mm round, advanced 50 meters, and was hit by 3 guns, firing simultaneously from positions that hadn't been visible seconds before. The Tiger survived, its armor was that good, but the crew's confidence in their invulnerability received its first shock. The minefields were worse than German intelligence had estimated. Soviet engineers had laid anti-tank mines in density, approaching 1,500 per kilometer in the main defensive sectors, arranged in irregular patterns that prevented simple lane clearing. The mines themselves were often wooden cased to defeat German metal detectors, or they were captured German mines relayed in German-marked minefields, creating deadly confusion for engineering units trying to clear paths. When combat engineers located and marked a lane through a minefield, Soviet artillery observers called down fire on that exact lane, forcing the engineers to start over elsewhere. Ferdinands, so heavily armored they could drive over mines that would destroy lighter tanks, led the breakthrough attempts, but their 65-ton weight meant that when they hit mines, they became immobilized, requiring recovery vehicles to extract them under fire. By noon on July 5th, Leibstandarte had lost 23 tanks to mines, not a single one to direct combat. The Soviet defenders fought with a desperation and tactical sophistication that surprised German commanders who remembered the poorly led, disorganized Red Army of 1941. The 52nd Guards Rifle Division, holding positions around Yakovlevo, demonstrated the evolution of Soviet tactical doctrine. Infantry remained in their trenches under German artillery barrages, emerging to engage when the barrage shifted, and German infantry advanced behind the tanks. Anti-tank rifles, weapons nearly useless against Tiger frontal armor, targeted tank tracks, optics, and exposed crew members. Molotov cocktails were thrown from trench positions at Panthers that approached too closely, aiming for engine decks where the gasoline-filled bottles could start fires. When positions became untenable, defenders retreated not in panic, but by squads through communication trenches to secondary positions, continuing resistance rather than surrendering or routing. The political commissars attached to every unit certainly contributed to this stubbornness through threats and ideological exhortation, but the primary factor was that Soviet soldiers in 1943 were defending their homeland against an invader who had murdered millions of their countrymen. They had reasons to fight beyond political coercion. By the afternoon of July 5th, Leibstandarte SS had battered its way through the first 2 Soviet defensive belts at Yakovlevo, achieving local breakthrough through sheer violence and accepting horrific costs. The village itself was a moonscape of craters, burning buildings, and destroyed equipment from both sides. 97 German tanks were destroyed or damaged, roughly 2/3 of them damaged and theoretically repairable, but requiring recovery under fire and days of maintenance. Soviet losses in the sector were far higher, over 300 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 4,200 casualties in the 52nd Guards Division alone. But the Soviet defenders had accomplished their mission: delay the German advance, inflict maximum casualties, buy time for reserves to arrive. Leibstandarte had penetrated 20 kilometers in 36 hours, far short of the 60 kilometers projected for 2 days. The division had suffered 1,149 casualties, and crucially, the Panthers that were supposed to provide breakthrough speed were breaking down faster than they were being knocked out. The pattern repeated across the entire southern sector. Das Reich Division advanced 15 kilometers in 2 days, losing 80 tanks. Totenkopf penetrated 18 kilometers, losing 63 tanks. The Germans were winning tactically. Every engagement ended with more Soviet than German casualties. Every position eventually fell to German assault, but the operational math was working against them. The plan required 30 kilometers per day advance to reach the encirclement objectives before Soviet reserves intervened. The reality was 10 kilometers per day against an enemy who had 7 more defensive belts behind the 2 already penetrated. German tank strength was depleting faster than Soviet defensive capacity. the minefields, the anti-tank positions, the pre-sighted artillery barrages, all were taking their toll on German armor that couldn't be quickly replaced. On the night of July 6th, Vatutin reviewed the situation at Voronezh front headquarters with a combination of concern and satisfaction. Concern because the Germans were breaking through, because Soviet casualties were enormous, because if the current rate of penetration continued, the German spearheads would reach critical objectives within a week. Satisfaction because the defensive concept was working, the Germans were being bled at rates they couldn't sustain, their vaunted new tanks were proving vulnerable to prepared defenses, and most importantly, Soviet reserves were moving into position for the counterattack that would end Citadel. He ordered 2nd Tank Corps and 2nd Guards Tank Corps to launch immediate counterattacks against the German flanks, knowing these formations would be destroyed, but calculating that they would buy the critical 48 to 72 hours needed for Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army to arrive. The counterattacks by 2nd and 2nd Guards Tank Corps on July 7th and 8th demonstrated both the improved quality of Soviet forces and the continuing problems with coordination that plagued Red Army operations. The two corps, comprising approximately 400 tanks between them, attacked the flanks of Leibstandardt's penetration near Yakovlevo in a pincer movement intended to cut off the German spearhead. The concept was sound, but the execution was flawed. The attacks went in sequentially, rather than simultaneously, allowing German forces to defeat them piecemeal. Artillery support was poorly coordinated, with supporting fire lifting too early and allowing German anti-tank guns to engage Soviet armor without suppression. Air support failed to materialize when Luftwaffe fighters intercepted the ground attack Il-2 Sturmovix before they reached the battlefield. The result was predictable and catastrophic. 2nd Tank Corps lost 90% of its armor in 8 hours of fighting. 2nd Guards Tank Corps lost 80%. But the sacrificial attacks achieved their purpose. They delayed the German advance by 2 full days, days that allowed Rotmistrov's forces to complete their forced march to Prokhorovka. By July 10th, the race was reaching its culmination. German 2nd SS Panzer Corps had advanced 35 kilometers in 6 days, suffering steady attrition but still combat effective, with approximately 330 operational tanks. The Corps had wheeled northeast toward Prokhorovka, recognizing that the rail junction and the flat terrain around it offered the best route to break through. Soviet forces had fought delaying actions with decreasing effectiveness as units were ground down, but the defensive system had bought the time needed. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was in position around Prokhorovka with 672 operational tanks, crews exhausted from the march, but vehicles refueled and rearmed. Neither side fully understood the other's situation. The Germans believed they were facing the remnants of shattered defensive formations, and that one more major push would achieve breakthrough, while the Soviets believed they outnumbered the Germans by 3-1 instead of the actual 2-1 ratio. Both sides were planning attacks for July 12th. The collision at Prokhorovka was now inevitable, and it would be unlike any tank battle in history. The village of Tetarovino fell to Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division at 2 p.m. on July 7, 1943, and with its capture, the commanding officers of 2nd SS Panzer Corps could see their objective. 15 kilometers to the northeast, Prokhorovka sat astride the Kursk-Belgorod rail line, a cluster of wooden buildings around a station that handled rail traffic critical to Soviet logistics. From the high ground at Tetarovino, German reconnaissance teams with field glasses could observe the approaches to the town, rolling countryside with wheat fields alternating with patches of forest, dissected by the Pesel River and its tributary streams. The terrain was more open than the close country they'd fought through for the past 48 hours, seemingly ideal for the kind of mobile armored warfare that German doctrine favored. Forward reconnaissance patrols reported minimal Soviet activity around Prokhorovka itself, suggesting the Soviets were still consolidating defenses. What the German observers couldn't see, because Soviet camouflage discipline was excellent, were the hundreds of tanks taking position in woods and reverse slopes, preparing positions for the counterattack Rotmistrov was planning. The race dynamic that developed between July 7th and 10th was fundamentally about time and information. The Germans needed to reach Prokhorovka quickly, before Soviet reinforcements arrived in strength, before their own mechanical attrition reduced combat power below effectiveness, before the window of opportunity closed. They didn't know that window had already closed, that 5th Guards tank army was arriving even as they planned their next advance. The Soviets needed to delay long enough for Rotmistrov's forces to arrive and deploy, needed to extract maximum time from minimum remaining combat power. Between these competing needs, Soviet units that had already suffered appalling casualties were ordered to conduct spoiling attacks they knew were suicidal, buying hours with hundreds of lives, holding ground that would be surrendered anyway, just to make the Germans work for every kilometer. 2nd Tank Corps launched its counterattack near Yakovlevo on the morning of July 8th, with orders that emphasized speed over preparation. The Corps had approximately 234s and 100 light tanks, supported by motorized rifle units, facing Leibstandards, Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs in prepared positions. The Soviet attack went in without adequate reconnaissance, without proper artillery preparation, across ground that German observers had already registered for defensive fire. The 34s advanced in line formation, textbook doctrine for exploitation attacks, but suicidal against prepared defenses. German anti-tank guns opened fire at 1,200 meters, beyond effective range for the 34's 76mm guns to return fire accurately. Tigers engaged at 1,500 meters, their 88mm guns punching through 34 frontal armor as if it were cardboard. The Soviet tanks tried to close range, accelerating to maximum speed, but they were charging across open wheat fields that provided no cover. Panthers joined the engagement at 800 meters, their long 75mm guns devastatingly accurate. The carnage unfolded over 3 hours. 2nd Tank Corps lost 180 tanks destroyed, another 42 damaged beyond field repair. Soviet casualty collection teams counted over 3,000 killed or wounded. The Corps effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. But those 3 hours, and the 8 kilometers of ground the Soviets contested before falling back, were 8 hours that German forces spent fighting instead of advancing, 8 kilometers they covered while under fire, instead of on the march. The Corps commander, Lieutenant General Alexei Popov, was killed when his command tank was hit by a Panther at 600 meters. His last radio transmission ordered his remaining forces to break contact and withdraw to secondary positions. German forces counted the destroyed Soviet tanks, reported a significant victory, and advanced another 5 kilometers before halting for the night to refuel and rearm. They had no idea they'd just fought a suicide mission that had achieved exactly what it was supposed to achieve. 2nd Guards Tank Corps attacked the southern flank of the German penetration on July 9th with similar results and similar purpose. This formation had fewer tanks but better training, elite Guards units that had distinguished themselves in earlier fighting. Their attack was better coordinated, with artillery support and even some air cover from Il-2 Sturmovix that broke through Luftwaffe fighters. The results were marginally better than 2nd Tank Corps had achieved. The Soviet forces penetrated German security zones, destroyed supply vehicles, forced 2 German battalions to redeploy defensively, but the cost was still catastrophic. 120 tanks destroyed, 2,800 casualties. Das Reich Division, which bore the brunt of this attack, lost 30 tanks and 600 casualties but held its positions. The Guards formation withdrew after 6 hours of fighting, having inflicted modest damage while suffering near total destruction. Another day purchased, another 1,000 Soviet soldiers dead, another 800 families who would receive the standardized notification that their sons or husbands had fallen defending the motherland. While these sacrificial counterattacks bought time on the ground, a parallel battle raged in the air above Prokhorovka. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights increased on July 9th and 10th as German commanders sought information about what lay ahead. Soviet fighters, primarily Yak-9s and La-5s, intercepted these flights when possible, trying to keep German photo reconnaissance from revealing the concentration of 5th Guards Tank Army. Some German reconnaissance aircraft got through, took photographs, and returned with images that showed increased Soviet activity but drastically underestimated the scale. Soviet photo interpreters, meanwhile, analyzed their own reconnaissance, showing German tank concentrations, noted the mix of Panthers and Tigers in numbers higher than any previous battle, briefed Rotmistrov on what his forces would face. The air war included ground attack missions, Luftwaffe Stukas diving on Soviet positions, Soviet Sturmovix attacking German assembly areas. Neither side achieved air superiority, creating conditions where both ground forces would fight without decisive air support. Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions wheeled northeast on July 9th and 10th, advancing on Prokhorovka from the south and southwest, while Leibstandarte approached from the west. This created the three-pronged attack formation that Paul Hauser, commanding 2nd SS Panzer Corps, favored multiple axes that prevented the enemy from concentrating against a single thrust, converging on a single objective where the attacks would mutually support. The maneuver looked textbook on the maps at Corps headquarters. In reality, the three divisions were out of contact with each other, separated by kilometers of uncertain ground, unable to coordinate their attacks in any detail beyond the general objective of reaching Prokhorovka. The interdivisional gaps should have been covered by reconnaissance units and flank security, but those forces had been attrited in earlier fighting or diverted to protect supply lines from Soviet partisan attacks. 2nd SS Panzer Corps was advancing into the culminating battle of its offensive, with its forces dispersed, its intelligence incomplete, and its commanders confident they were facing broken Soviet remnants rather than a fresh tank army. Rotmistrov spent July 9th and 10th positioning his forces, with the care of a chess master setting up a decisive combination. He placed his strongest corps, the 29th Tank Corps, with its 212 34s, on the high ground east of the Pell River, covering the direct approach from the west. The 18th Tank Corps, 180 tanks, deployed south of Prokhorovka, covering the approach from Das Reich Division. The 2nd Tank Corps, a different formation from the 2nd Tank Corps that had been destroyed on July 8th, took positions northeast of town with 122 tanks, creating a reserve that could counterattack any German penetration or exploit a German weakness. The positioning reflected Soviet deep battle theory, a strong first echelon to meet the German attack, a powerful second echelon to exploit success or shore up failure, all concentrated in a relatively small area where weight of numbers could overcome German technical superiority. The night of July 10th saw final preparations on both sides that revealed how differently the armies functioned. German units conducted detailed planning sessions, officers briefing their subordinates with maps and clear objectives, tank crews performing methodical maintenance checks, supply units distributing ammunition and fuel according to calculated requirements. The German preparation was professional, thorough, confident, the product of a military culture that prized precision and technical competence. Soviet preparation was cruder, but perhaps more effective in the circumstances. Political officers moved through the tank parks reading Stalin's order of the day, emphasizing the stakes, threatening punishment for cowardice while promising rewards for valor. Tank crews slept under their vehicles, exhausted from the forced march, grabbing what rest they could. Supply units distributed ammunition somewhat chaotically, ensuring every tank had a basic load, but without the precise distribution the Germans achieved. The contrast reflected deeper truths about the two militaries. The Germans were more professional but brittle, capable of excellent performance under expected conditions but vulnerable to surprise. The Soviets were more resilient but wasteful, capable of absorbing enormous punishment and continuing to fight but at tremendous human cost. By dawn on July 11th, the two armies were positioned for collision but still didn't fully understand each other. German intelligence estimated Soviet strength at approximately 250 tanks based on aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation. The reality was 672 operational Soviet tanks, a 2.7-to-1 numerical advantage the Germans didn't know they faced. Soviet intelligence estimated German strength at 500 to 600 tanks. The reality was approximately 330 operational German tanks, after a week of attrition, roughly equal to Soviet estimates, but with a far higher proportion of powerful Tigers and Panthers than Soviet planners expected. Both sides were planning attacks for July 12th. The Germans intended to resume their offensive toward Prokhorovka, expecting to brush aside Soviet remnants and achieve the breakthrough that would justify Citadel's costs. The Soviets intended to launch a massive counterattack, crushing the German spearhead with weight of numbers, implementing the counteroffensive that would turn defense into liberation. Neither plan would survive contact with the enemy. What neither side fully grasped was that they were about to collide in terrain that would negate German range advantages, at a time when Soviet desperation matched German confidence, in conditions where the battle would be decided less by technology or tactics than by the willingness of exhausted men to continue fighting when every rational calculation said to stop. The sun set over Prokhorovka at 8:47 p.m. on July 11, 1943, painting the wheat fields in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful if thousands of men weren't preparing to kill each other there at dawn. In a reinforced bunker 500 meters behind the rail station, Pavel Rotmistrov convened his final orders conference with the commanders of his 3 tank corps, their faces illuminated by kerosene lamps that cast dancing shadows on maps spread across rough wooden tables. The maps showed Prokhorovka at the center, marked with red symbols indicating Soviet positions and blue symbols showing estimated German locations, based on reconnaissance reports that were already hours old and potentially obsolete. Rotmistrov's orders were direct and unambiguous. Attack at 8:30 a.m. on July 12th, advance southwest across the Pisel River Valley, close with German armor at maximum speed to negate their range advantage, destroy the enemy in close combat. The Corps commanders, hardened veterans who had survived 2 years of the most brutal fighting in human history, listened without expression, asked technical questions about artillery support and air cover, acknowledged their orders, and departed to brief their subordinates. What Rotmistrov didn't share with his Corps commanders, because there was no point burdening them with information that wouldn't change their orders, was the personal message he'd received from Stalin that afternoon. The telegram, delivered by courier from front headquarters, was brief and carried the weight of absolute command. The fate of Voronezh front depends on the decisive defeat of enemy tank forces at Prokhorovka. There can be no retreat. Victory or death. The message was classic Stalin, combining strategic assessment with personal threat, making clear that failure would result in consequences more severe than anything the Germans might inflict. Rotmistrov had burned the telegram after reading it, but the words were seared into his memory. He understood perfectly that if 5th Guards Tank Army failed to stop the German offensive, he would be relieved of command, court-martialed for incompetence or cowardice, and quite possibly shot. The Soviet system did not tolerate failure, especially not in commanders personally appointed by Stalin. 22 kilometers southwest, SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser reviewed the situation at 2nd SS Panzer Corps headquarters with considerably more optimism than the tactical position warranted. The intelligence map showed Soviet defensive positions around Prokhorovka, but the strength estimates were drastically low. 250 tanks, mostly 34s, supported by infantry and anti-tank guns. Hauser's operations officer briefed the attack plan. Leibstandarte would advance directly on Prokhorovka from the west at dawn. Das Reich would attack from the southwest. Totenkopf would fix Soviet forces in place north of the Pisel River. The three-pronged attack would converge on the rail station by mid-afternoon, crushing Soviet resistance through superior firepower and tactical skill. Hauser approved the plan, ordered hour for 6 a.m., and dismissed his staff to prepare their units. What concerned him, though he didn't voice it to his subordinates, was the attrition his corps had suffered. Starting the offensive with 500 tanks, he now had 330 operational, a 34% reduction in a week. The Panthers were the worst, mechanical failures outpacing combat losses 3-1. In the tank parks on both sides, crews performed the rituals that soldiers have practiced before battle since ancient times. German tankers of Leibstandarte's Tiger companies gathered around their 56-ton machines, performing final maintenance checks with the thoroughness that German military culture demanded. They topped off fuel tanks, loaded ammunition racks to capacity 92 rounds per Tiger, each round weighing over 20 kilograms. They checked oil levels, tested radios, cleaned periscopes and gun sights. The Tiger crews were confident they had seen their 88mm guns destroy 34s at ranges beyond 2,000 meters, had felt enemy shells bounce off their armor without penetrating. Their commanders briefed them on the morning's attack, showed them aerial photos of the approaches to Prokhorovka, pointed out likely Soviet positions. No one mentioned that the photos were taken 2 days ago, that Soviet reinforcements had arrived since then, that the estimates of enemy strength might be catastrophically wrong. Soviet tank crews 5 kilometers away conducted their own preparations with less technical precision but equal intensity. 34 crews of the 29th Tank Corps slept under their tanks or in nearby houses evacuated by civilians, grabbing rest where they could find it. Political officers moved through the units conducting what the Red Army called political moral preparation, reading Stalin's orders, recounting German atrocities against Soviet civilians, emphasizing the stakes of tomorrow's battle. The political preparation was partly genuine ideological indoctrination, partly psychological preparation for the horror of combat, and partly threat. Commissars had the authority to shoot soldiers who displayed cowardice, and everyone knew that authority was exercised regularly. Some crews were veterans with multiple battles behind them, cynical about political rhetoric but grimly determined. Others were replacements fresh from training schools, 18 and 19 years old, who had never been in combat and whose life expectancy in the coming battle could be measured in minutes. At 11 p.m., Rotmistrov walked through the tank parks of the 29th Corps, performing the ancient commander's ritual of being seen by his troops on the eve of battle. He stopped at individual tanks, spoke briefly with crews, asked about their readiness, expressed confidence in their abilities. The theater was conscious. Both he and the soldiers knew this was performance, but it served a purpose. The men saw that their army commander wasn't cowering in a bunker but sharing their danger, and that recognition provided a morale boost that no political officer's speech could match. Rotmistrov noticed details that troubled him. The youth of many crews, barely old enough to shave, the exhaustion visible in their faces after the forced march from Steppe front, the way some checked and rechecked their equipment with the nervous energy of men trying not to think about tomorrow. He kept his concerns to himself, maintained his confident expression, and returned to his command post at midnight to await the dawn. The German plan assumed a continuation of the week's pattern advance against Soviet defensive positions, suppress resistance with superior firepower, break through, and exploit. The plan was fundamentally offensive, based on German initiative dictating the battle's tempo and terms. What German planning didn't account for was the possibility that the Soviets wouldn't wait to be attacked, that they might launch their own offensive simultaneously, that the battle might become a meeting engagement rather than an assault on prepared positions. This wasn't stupidity or negligence on the German planners' part. Their intelligence suggested they were facing defensive remnants, and their doctrine emphasized seizing initiative through offensive action. But the intelligence was wrong, and that error would prove fatal to German planning. The Soviet plan was simpler and more desperate. Rotmistrov understood that his 34s couldn't fight tigers and panthers at long range. The German tanks would destroy his forces before his guns could even penetrate their armor. His only chance was to close range as quickly as possible, getting inside 500 meters where 34 76mm guns could penetrate Panther side armor and possibly Tiger rear armor. This required charging directly at the enemy, accepting horrific losses during the approach, gambling that enough Soviet tanks would survive to close range and overwhelm the Germans through numbers. It was a brutal calculus, trading 3 or 4 34s for each Tiger, 5 or 6 for each Panther, knowing that even with those loss ratios, Soviet numerical superiority meant ultimate victory if the attack pressed home. The plan required courage from the tankers, ruthlessness from the commanders, and a willingness to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable for Western Allied forces. At 12:30 a.m. on July 12th, Soviet artillery units received fire missions for the morning attack. 8,000 guns and rocket launchers of Voronezh Front artillery would support 5th Guards Tank Army's attack, delivering preparatory fires on German positions from 5 a.m. to 6:30 a.m., then shifting to deep interdiction targets when the tank attack began. The artillery plan was sophisticated, integrating multiple calibers and missions, heavy guns targeting German artillery positions identified through sound ranging and aerial reconnaissance, medium guns suppressing infantry and anti-tank positions, Katyusha rocket launchers delivering area saturation fires on suspected German assembly areas. Soviet artillerymen began bringing ammunition forward from dumps, stacking shells and rockets near gun positions, preparing for the dawn barrage that would announce 5th Guards Tank Army's attack. The night was not quiet. German artillery fired harassing missions on suspected Soviet positions, the shells creating random explosions that kept men awake and nerves taut. Soviet artillery returned fire, the exchanges lacking the intensity of a real barrage, but maintaining pressure, preventing rest. Luftwaffe night bombers dropped flares and bombs on Prokhorovka, trying to disrupt Soviet preparations, while Soviet night fighters attempted interceptions with limited success. The temperature dropped from the day's heat, creating ground fog in low areas that would burn off with the sunrise, but might provide concealment for the first hour of fighting. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light for movement but creating shadows that turned every bush into an imagined enemy, every sound into a potential threat. In their respective headquarters, Rotmistrov and Hauser each believed they would win decisively in the morning. Hauser believed German technical superiority would prevail, as it had for a week, that one more push would shatter Soviet resistance and achieve the breakthrough Citadel required. His confidence was based on experience, a week of successful advances, superior equipment, elite troops who had never failed him. Rotmistrov believed Soviet numerical superiority and operational surprise would overwhelm the Germans, that the weight of over 600 tanks attacking simultaneously would crush the German spearhead. His confidence was based on desperation, the knowledge that failure meant personal destruction and potentially the collapse of Voronezh Front's defenses. Both men were partially right and completely wrong. The battle they expected would bear almost no resemblance to the battle they would get. At 3 a.m., Rotmistrov lay down for 2 hours of sleep, setting his watch alarm for 5 a.m. At 3:30 a.m., Hauser did the same, his alarm set for 5:30. Neither man would sleep soundly, and neither would be rested when the alarms woke them to command the largest single-day tank battle in history. The stage was set, the forces positioned, the plans made. In 5 hours, Prokhorovka would become a name remembered for generations as the high-water mark of German offensive operations in the East, though the reasons for that remembrance would be debated for decades. The Soviet artillery barrage began at 5 a.m. precisely, 15 minutes before first light on July 12, 1943, as 8,000 guns and rocket launchers opened fire across a front 20 kilometers wide. The sound was beyond description. Veterans who survived later struggled to explain it to those who weren't there, settling on inadequate comparisons to thunderstorms or earthquakes that captured the volume, but not the visceral terror of knowing that each explosion was intended to kill you. German soldiers in assembly areas dove for cover as shells screamed overhead, impacting in patterns that walked methodically across suspected concentration points, communication trenches, and artillery positions. The barrage lasted 15 minutes, stopped abruptly, and left a ringing silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been. In that silence, tank engines coughed to life on both sides, and over 800 armored vehicles began moving toward collision. The 29th Tank Corps crested the ridgeline near Storozhevoy at 6:30 a.m., and the sight that greeted Lieutenant Colonel Grigory Penyezhko, commanding the 31st Tank Brigade, was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. The valley before him stretched 3 kilometers to the southwest, wheat fields interspersed with patches of forest, and the Pisel River's tributaries creating natural channels. On the far side of the valley, German armor was visible as dark shapes emerging from morning mist. Panthers and tigers, identifiable by their silhouettes, even at 1,500 meters, accompanied by smaller Panzer IVs and what looked like assault guns. Penyezhko counted approximately 60 tanks in his immediate view, and knew there would be more beyond his line of sight. He grabbed his radio handset and transmitted the single code word that committed his 212 34s to attack. Steel. Along the ridgeline, tank engines roared to maximum power, and the entire first echelon of 5th Guards Tank Army lurched forward into the valley. The first German tank kill occurred at 6:50 a.m., when a Tiger I of Leibstandart's 13th Heavy Tank Company engaged a 34 at 1,800 meters. Unterscharführer Otto Carius, commanding the Tiger, later described the shot in his memoirs. The 34 appeared as a tiny dark rectangle in his commander's optics. He ordered his gunner to traverse right. The gunner confirmed the target. Carius ordered fire. The 88mm gun recoiled with a crack that deafened everyone in the turret, and the target simply exploded in a ball of orange flame as the tungsten core round penetrated the 34's frontal armor and detonated its ammunition. The entire sequence took 12 seconds from target acquisition to destruction. Carius's gunner immediately traversed to a second target, fired, and destroyed another 34 at 1,700 meters. The pattern repeated across the German line, Tigers and Panthers, engaging at maximum range, destroying Soviet tanks that couldn't effectively return fire at those distances. The Soviet charge didn't falter. The tanks of the 31st Brigade accelerated downhill, building speed, buttoned up with hatches closed, and commanders peering through periscopes that gave limited visibility but protection from splinters and machine gun fire. The 34's diesel engines screamed at maximum RPM, their Christie suspension compressing and extending as the tanks bounced over uneven ground at 40 kilometers per hour. German shells created geysers of dirt around the advancing Soviet tanks near misses that testified to the difficulty of hitting moving targets even with the finest optics and training. But enough shells found their marks. A 34 took a Panther round through the glacis plate at 1,200 meters, the crew killed instantly by the penetration. Another lost a track to an 88mm hit at 1,400 meters, slewed sideways, and was struck by 2 more rounds before the crew could bail out. A third brewed up tanker slang for catastrophic ammunition fire at 900 meters, its turret blown completely off the hull by the explosion of 76mm rounds cooking off in their racks. The German kill rate was phenomenal, but it wasn't enough. For every 34 destroyed, 3 more continued the charge. For every Soviet crew killed, another crew behind them maintained speed and direction. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The Germans could kill individual tanks faster than individual Soviets could kill individual Germans. But the Soviets had 3 times as many tanks and didn't need to kill German tanks at long range. They just needed to survive long enough to close range. At 7:15 a.m., the lead elements of the Soviet charge reached 800 meters from the German line. At 7:20, they reached 600 meters. German tank commanders who had been calmly engaging targets at range suddenly found themselves facing a tidal wave of Soviet armor that refused to stop despite losses that should have broken any rational force. At 7:30 a.m., the character of the battle changed utterly. The first Soviet tanks closed to under 500 meters, and at that range, 34 76mm guns could penetrate Panther side armor. A 34 of the 32nd Brigade put a round into a Panther's flank at 400 meters, the shell penetrating and igniting ammunition that destroyed the German tank in a secondary explosion. Another 34 rammed a Panzer IV that had been hit and immobilized, both tanks disabled, both crews bailing out and continuing the fight with pistols and submachine guns. A Tiger destroyed 4 34s in 90 seconds, but was then swarmed by 6 more Soviet tanks, firing from multiple angles, one round penetrating the engine deck and starting a fire that forced the crew to abandon the vehicle. The battle dissolved from the ordered long-range engagement German doctrine preferred into a chaotic melee, where training and equipment quality mattered less than courage and luck. The density of fighting reached levels unprecedented in armored warfare. In a rough square approximately 3 kilometers on each side, over 600 tanks were attempting to destroy each other simultaneously. The separation between friend and enemy became fluid. Soviet and German tanks were intermixed, some fighting at ranges under 100 meters, some accidentally presenting their vulnerable side or rear armor to enemies they didn't see because visibility was obscured by smoke from burning vehicles and dust thrown up by tracks and explosions. A Soviet tank commander described the scene years later. You couldn't see 50 meters in any direction. You just drove forward, fired at any tank that didn't look like yours, and tried not to think about what would happen when the tank next to you exploded and you were close enough to feel the heat. The noise was beyond anything the crews had experienced. Inside the tanks, the sound of their own gun firing was deafening. Despite the crews wearing leather helmets, the overpressure from an 88mm or 76mm gun firing in an enclosed space caused physical pain, temporary hearing loss, and disorientation. Outside, the cacophony included tank engines at maximum throttle, machine guns firing continuously, shells impacting armor with sounds like giant hammers striking anvils, Ammunition exploding inside hit tanks with cracks that momentarily exceeded all other sounds, and the screams of wounded men that carried across the battlefield despite the mechanical din. Veterans later reported they couldn't hear properly for days after the battle, and some suffered permanent hearing damage. At 8 a.m., Rotmistrov committed his second echelon. The 18th Tank Corps, which had been in reserve positions northeast of Prokhorovka, received orders to advance and support the 29th Corps' assault. 180 additional 34s and light tanks poured into a battle space already saturated with armor, adding to the density and chaos. From his command post, Rotmistrov could see smoke rising from the battlefield, but had only fragmentary reports about the actual situation. Radio communications were sporadic, with many reports consisting of nothing but screaming or static as tanks were hit while transmitting. His staff tried to maintain situation maps, but the markers were guesswork based on outdated information. The only thing certain was that the battle was developing into exactly the kind of close-quarters fight Rotmistrov had planned, though at a cost in lives and machines that exceeded even his pessimistic projections. German commanders faced similar problems of command and control. Hauser at Corps headquarters had lost radio contact with battalion-level units, receiving only sporadic reports from division commanders who themselves had incomplete pictures of their formation status. What reports did arrive were fragmentary and often contradictory. One reported successful advance, another reported being counterattacked by overwhelming forces, a third reported being surrounded and breaking out toward German lines. The orderly battle Hauser had planned had disintegrated into hundreds of individual tank duels and small unit actions that defied coordination. He ordered his reserve, a company of Tigers from the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, to advance and restore the situation, but the reserve company could only affect a tiny portion of the 15-square-kilometer battlefield. By 9 a.m., 3.5 hours into the battle, the slaughter had reached its peak intensity. Soviet forces had lost approximately 230 tanks destroyed, another 100 damaged. German forces had lost approximately 40 tanks completely destroyed, another 70 damaged and requiring recovery. The loss ratio favored the Germans 5-1, but the absolute numbers told a different story. The Soviets still had over 400 operational tanks on the battlefield, while the Germans were down to 220. More critically, German ammunition was running low. Tigers had exhausted their 92-round load in 45 minutes of intense combat and were withdrawing to resupply points. Panthers were experiencing mechanical failures from sustained combat operations, transmissions overheating, final drives cracking under the stress of constant maneuvering. The Germans were winning tactically but losing operationally, destroying more than they lost but unable to break Soviet will or reduce Soviet numbers below the critical mass needed to continue attacking. The wheat fields around Prokhorovka had become an industrial slaughterhouse where courage and technology met desperation and numbers, and neither side could gain decisive advantage. At 9 a.m. on July 12, 1943, the density of fighting at Prokhorovka reached conditions no military theorist had anticipated and no commander could control. Within a rough rectangle measuring approximately 5 kilometers east to west and 3 kilometers north to south, 15 square kilometers total, over 600 tanks were attempting to destroy each other in conditions that made systematic tactics impossible. The battlefield had dissolved into what German after-action reports called tank chaos, and Soviet accounts described as the steel whirlwind. Visibility was reduced to 50 meters or less by smoke from burning vehicles, dust thrown up by hundreds of tank tracks, and the morning fog that hadn't completely burned off. Tank commanders buttoned up inside their armored boxes had almost no situational awareness beyond what they could see through narrow periscopes, making target identification difficult and distinguishing friend from enemy nearly impossible until dangerously close. The fighting at Storozovoy village exemplified the brutal character of the battle at 9:30 a.m. The Soviet 181st Tank Brigade, part of the 18th Tank Corps, attacked German positions in and around the village with 64 34s, their objective to seize the high ground and open routes for follow-on forces. German defenders, a mixed force of Panthers from Das Reich Division and infantry with anti-tank guns, had prepared positions overnight, digging in the tank's hull down and sighting guns for overlapping fields of fire. The Soviet attack went in without smoke or artillery support because communications with supporting units had broken down in the chaos. The result was predictable: 34s advancing across open ground toward prepared positions, silhouetted against the dawn sky, presenting perfect targets. German Panthers and anti-tank guns opened fire at 700 meters, methodically destroying the lead Soviet platoons. But the Soviet brigade didn't stop commanders, knowing that stopping meant death, that survival required closing to point-blank range where German advantages disappeared. The Soviet tanks that survived the initial gauntlet, 18 of the first platoon of 20, crashed into the German positions at full speed, literally overrunning anti-tank gun positions, crushing guns and crews under 30-ton tracks. Firing their 76mm guns at ranges under 100 meters into Panthers that couldn't depress their main guns low enough to engage targets that close. A 34 commanded by Lieutenant Alexander Belly rammed a Tiger I that had destroyed his entire platoon, the collision occurring at combined speeds exceeding 70 kilometers per hour. Both tanks were disabled by the impact. The 34's front hull crumpled, the Tiger's left track thrown, both engines stalled from the shock. Crews from both tanks bailed out and immediately began fighting with pistols, submachine guns, and entrenching tools in savage close-quarters combat that ended when Soviet infantry arrived and overwhelmed the German crew through numbers. The Panther, commanded by Unterscharführer Franz Staudiger, became surrounded by Soviet tanks at approximately 10 a.m. in what would become one of the most legendary and controversial single-tank actions of the war. Staudiger's after-action report, filed 3 days later, claimed his crew destroyed 22 34s in 30 minutes while maneuvering through Soviet formations in reverse, using the Panther's excellent reverse speed to keep distance while the gunner engaged targets systematically. Soviet records show no evidence of a single Panther destroying 22 tanks in that sector, though they confirm heavy losses to a German tank that eventually withdrew. Post-war analysis suggests Staudiger probably destroyed 8 to 10 tanks, still a remarkable feat, but his gunner claimed kills that were actually shared with other German tanks, and in the confusion, those shared kills were credited to Staudiger alone. What's undisputed is that Staudiger's Panther expended its entire 82-round ammunition load in under an hour, and withdrew to rearm only when the main gun's breech became too hot to load safely. The Soviet tactics evolved in real time, as commanders realized that attempting to fight at range meant death. Brigade and battalion commanders began ordering close assault tactics that violated every principle of Soviet armored doctrine, but worked in these specific conditions. 34s were ordered to close within 200 meters, regardless of losses during the approach, then attack from multiple angles simultaneously to overwhelm German tanks that could destroy any single 34, but couldn't engage 3 or 4, attacking from different directions at once. A Tiger near the Paysel River destroyed 7 34s in 12 minutes, each at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, before 3 more 34s attacked simultaneously from the left, right, and rear at under 300 meters. The Tiger's commander tried to engage all 3 threats, rotating the turret frantically while the driver attempted to maneuver to create distance. But the 3-to-1 local advantage proved decisive. 2 34s were destroyed, but the third penetrated the Tiger's engine deck with a shot from 200 meters, starting a fire that forced the crew to bail out. At 10:30 a.m., the Luftwaffe intervened with a major ground attack on Soviet second echelon formations, moving up to reinforce the battle. 40 Stuka dive bombers attacked the 18th Tank Corps while it maneuvered from reserve positions toward the main battle, catching the Soviet tanks in march column on the approach road. The Stukas dove from 3,000 meters, their sirens creating the characteristic wailing scream designed to terrify enemy troops, releasing 1,000-pound bombs from under 600 meters altitude. 27 34s were destroyed or disabled in 15 minutes, not primarily by direct hits, which were rare, but by near misses that threw tracks, cracked engine blocks, or killed crew members through concussion. Soviet air defense was ineffective. The ZSU anti-aircraft tanks couldn't depress their guns enough to engage diving aircraft, and fighter cover failed to intercept the Stukas before they attacked. The losses forced 18th Tank Corps to halt and reorganize, delaying its reinforcement of the main battle by over an hour. The German infantry fighting alongside the panzers experienced a different kind of hell at Prokhorovka. Panzer Grenadiers' elite motorized infantry, who normally worked in close cooperation with tanks, found themselves in terrain where that cooperation broke down completely. A company of Leibstandart infantry, defending a grain field near the Pisel River, was overrun when Soviet tanks crashed through their positions, literally driving over foxholes and firing machine guns at soldiers who had no weapons that could damage the 34s. 43 men were killed or wounded in 10 minutes, the survivors falling back in disorder. Other infantry units found themselves unable to distinguish friendly from enemy tanks in the smoke and dust, firing Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons at shapes that turned out to be Panthers. Friendly fire casualties among German infantry exceeded 30% in some units. At 11 a.m., the height of confusion, German and Soviet infantry found themselves fighting hand-to-hand in the same grain field while tanks of both sides operated 200 meters away, neither tanker nor infantry able to support the other because neither could identify targets in the chaos. A Soviet rifle company and a German Panzer Grenadier platoon fought a 40-minute battle in wheat that grew chest-high. The two forces so intermixed that officers on both sides ordered ceasefire for fear of shooting their own men. The engagement ended when both units withdrew by mutual unspoken agreement, leaving 18 Soviet and 11 German dead in the wheat. Neither side claimed the ground it wasn't strategically important, and holding it risked being killed by friendly tanks that couldn't see infantry in the grain. The mechanical toll on German armor exceeded combat losses in some units by 11:30 a.m. Panthers that had survived the battle unscathed began breaking down from sustained operation at combat power levels German designers hadn't anticipated. Transmissions overheated and seized. Final drives cracked from the constant stress of acceleration, braking, and turning at maximum power. Engines developed oil leaks that progressed to catastrophic failures. A company of Panthers from Das Reich Division started the morning with 14 operational tanks, lost 3 to enemy fire by noon, and lost 6 more to mechanical breakdown that made them combat ineffective. Maintenance crews trying to recover damaged and broken vehicles came under fire from Soviet tanks that had penetrated German rear areas, adding casualties among recovery personnel to the mounting toll. By noon, both sides' commands were receiving fragmentary and contradictory reports that made coherent assessment impossible. Rotmistrov knew his forces had suffered catastrophic losses, but believed based on optimistic reporting from subordinates that German losses were even worse. Hauser knew his forces were holding positions but had no clear picture of enemy strength or his own remaining combat power. Both commanders faced the same fundamental question: continue the battle and risk total destruction of their forces, or break contact and accept failure to achieve objectives. Neither commander had authority to make that decision alone. Rotmistrov needed approval from front headquarters, Hauser from Army Group South. But communication with higher headquarters was sporadic, and even when connections worked, the situation was too fluid to permit informed decision-making from generals who couldn't see the battlefield. The battle had developed its own momentum, independent of either side's intentions, and that momentum would carry it forward regardless of casualties until something broke either Soviet will to continue attacking or German ability to continue defending. Around Prokhorovka at midday on July 12th, over 1,500 men were already dead, 300 tanks destroyed, and neither side could claim they were winning. 22-year-old Pavel Vasiliev experienced death 3 times on July 12th, 1943, and somehow survived each encounter to tell the story 60 years later. His first death came at 7:45 a.m. when his 34 took a Panther round through the driver's compartment at 800 meters. Vasiliev was the tank's driver, seated in the right front hull position, when the 75mm armor-piercing round penetrated the glacis plate 18 centimeters to his left. The round killed his co-driver instantly. Vasiliev never learned the man's name, a replacement who had joined the crew 2 days earlier, but somehow missed Vasiliev himself, despite passing close enough that he felt the heat of the shell. The crew bailed out through the top hatches while the tank burned, ran 300 meters to a disabled 34 whose crew was dead, commandeered that tank, and rejoined the attack within 15 minutes. Vasiliev drove that second tank for 40 minutes before a Tiger put an 88mm round through the turret at 600 meters, killing the commander and gunner but leaving Vasiliev and the loader alive in the hull. They bailed out again, found a third 34 abandoned with mechanical problems but otherwise intact, got the engine started, and drove it back towards Soviet lines. A German anti-tank gun hit the third tank at 300 meters, the round penetrating low on the hull and detonating stored ammunition. The explosion of the ammunition in Vasiliev's third tank created his third death experience, but this one was different from the clean escapes of the first two. The blast blew the loader's body apart. Vasiliev never saw what happened, only found himself suddenly covered in blood and tissue that wasn't his own. The explosion also ignited hydraulic fluid and diesel fuel, creating an inferno inside the crew compartment. Vasiliev tried to open the driver's hatch, but discovered it was jammed, probably bent by the impact of the anti-tank round. He could feel his skin burning, smell his hair igniting, hear himself screaming, though he had no memory of deciding to scream. The loader's hatch above and behind him was open. The loader had been halfway out when the explosion killed him, but Vasiliev couldn't reach it from the driver's position. He tried to climb out of his seat, discovered his left leg wouldn't move, looked down and saw his foot pinned under the seat mounting that had been twisted by the explosion. The interior temperature was rising every second as the fire spread. He worked his foot free by unlacing his boot and pulling his leg out, leaving the boot pinned, climbed past the loader's body, and pulled himself through the hatch onto the tank's deck. His uniform was on fire. He rolled off the tank and into the dirt, rolling repeatedly to extinguish the flames, then ran stumbling toward Soviet lines wearing only one boot and with burns covering 40% of his body. He survived the war, worked in a factory making tractors, and died in 2011 at age 90, his torso still covered in scars from that day at Prokhorovka. SS Untersturmführer Michael Wittmann's engagement on July 12th became the foundation of a legend that post-war research has never fully untangled from propaganda and myth. Wittmann commanded a Tiger I in the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, and his radio traffic intercepted by Soviet signals intelligence indicates he destroyed 8 Soviet tanks that day, a significant but not extraordinary achievement for a Tiger commander in intense combat. Post-war accounts, including Wittmann's own recommendations for decorations, claimed numbers ranging from 12 to 30 kills. The higher figures appear to be the result of several factors. German commanders needed propaganda victories and inflated kill claims. Wittmann genuinely couldn't identify which destroyed tanks were his kills versus those of other German tanks in the same sector, and the German practice of crediting the senior tank in a platoon with all kills achieved by the platoon. What's documented is that Wittmann's Tiger engaged a KV-1 heavy tank, a rare encounter, as most Soviet armor at Prokhorovka were 34s in a duel that lasted approximately 10 minutes and involved both tanks maneuvering for position at ranges between 500 and 100 meters. The KV-1 was obsolete by 1943 standards, slower and less effective than 34s, but its armor was thick enough to resist Wittmann's 88mm gun at certain angles. The duel became a contest of maneuvering the Tiger, trying to get a flank or rear shot where its superior gun would be decisive, the KV trying to close range where its slightly larger 76mm gun might penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. Both commanders were experienced, both crews well-trained. They circled each other in an open field near Storozhevoy, tracks tearing up wheat, main guns firing and missing because both tanks were moving, machine guns blazing at vision blocks and hatches, trying to blind the opposing crew. The duel ended when Wittmann's gunner got a side shot at 90 meters while both tanks were moving, the round penetrating just behind the KV's turret ring and detonating ammunition. The Soviet crew never emerged from the burning tank. Wittmann's Tiger had been hit 3 times during the engagement all rounds, striking frontal armor that was too thick to penetrate, and his crew was so deafened by the impacts that they didn't hear radio calls for the next 20 minutes. Commander Grigory Penyezhko's ramming attack at approximately 9:30 a.m. became the subject of Soviet propaganda films and newspaper accounts, but Penyezhko's own diary entry about the incident is remarkably matter-of-fact. His 34's main gun jammed after firing 23 rounds, a common malfunction when shell casings expanded from heat and wedged in the chamber. Penyezhko faced a choice: withdraw to repair the gun and abandon his platoon, or continue fighting with only his machine guns and ram the Tiger that was systematically destroying Soviet tanks 300 meters ahead. Soviet doctrine specifically authorized ramming attacks when circumstances warranted, a reflection of the desperate tactics the Red Army was willing to employ. Penyezhko ordered his driver to accelerate toward the Tiger, which was buttoned up and whose commander apparently never saw the 34 approaching from an oblique angle at 40 kilometers per hour. The collision occurred with enough force that both crews reported feeling like they'd been hit by artillery. Penyezhko's 34 suffered crushed front armor and a stalled engine. The Tiger's left track was knocked off, and its hull twisted enough to jam the turret traverse mechanism. Both crews bailed out and began shooting at each other with pistols and submachine guns at ranges under 20 meters. Absurd combat between men who had just collided in 30-ton and 56-ton vehicles, now trying to kill each other with weapons designed for ranges under 100 meters. The engagement ended when Soviet infantry arrived, and the German crew, outnumbered 6-1, surrendered. Penyezhko was wounded by a pistol round that passed through his left shoulder, but didn't hit major blood vessels. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union decoration in August 1943, partially for the ramming, but primarily for the overall leadership that had brought his brigade through the battle relatively intact. His diary entry for July 12th focuses less on the ramming than on the 26 crews from his brigade who didn't survive the day. I know I should feel proud of the decoration, but when I see the empty bunks in the crew quarters, I mostly feel grateful to be alive and guilty that I lived when so many didn't. A 4-man German Panther crew from Das Reich Division experienced the mechanical nightmare that haunted German armor throughout Prokhorovka when their transmission failed catastrophically at 10:45 a.m. during combat operations. The Panther was engaging Soviet tanks from a hull-down position, having destroyed 4 34s in 10 minutes. When the driver attempted to back up to change position and the transmission simply disintegrated, the Panther became a 45-ton, immobile pillbox, capable of fighting but unable to maneuver. The crew continued engaging targets for another 20 minutes, destroying 2 more Soviet tanks, but Soviet forces identified the immobilized Panther and began concentrating fire. 3 34s attacked from different angles, forcing the German crew to choose which threat to engage, while the others closed range. The commander ordered the crew to abandon the vehicle when Soviet infantry were spotted approaching with satchel charges. The 4-man crew began a 6-kilometer journey back to German lines on foot, moving through a battlefield where both sides were still actively fighting, hiding in grain fields when tanks approached, dodging Soviet infantry patrols, navigating by compass toward the southwest. They reached German positions after 4 hours, having witnessed the battle from a perspective no tank crew normally experiences as infantry in the midst of an armored engagement. Soviet radioman Nikolai Dragan spent 45 minutes trapped in a burning 34 after his driver was killed by a penetrating round, and the driver's dead weight collapsed against the driver's hatch. Operating lever, jamming it closed. The 34's internal layout meant Dragan, positioned in the right front hull as radio operator, could only escape through the driver's hatch or through the turret hatches above and behind him. The turret hatches were blocked by dead or wounded crew members trying to escape themselves. The driver's hatch wouldn't open because the dead driver's body weight plus his combat gear created pressure the hatch mechanism couldn't overcome. Fire was spreading from the engine compartment forward, creating heat and smoke that made breathing increasingly difficult. Dragan could hear the external sounds of battle machine guns, explosions, shouting, but no one responded to his screaming for help because the external noise drowned out his voice. He tried repeatedly to move the driver's body, but couldn't generate enough leverage from his cramped position. After what seemed like hours, but was actually 45 minutes, the driver's body shifted slightly as the fire burned through the seat harness holding it, and Dragan was able to kick the driver's hatch open enough to squeeze through. He emerged into a battlefield empty of active combat. The fighting had moved 400 meters north while he was trapped. His 34 was burning intensely, the ammunition cooking off in sporadic explosions. He ran 200 meters from the tank before collapsing from smoke inhalation and minor burns. A Soviet medical team found him 2 hours later and evacuated him to a field hospital. He was hospitalized for 3 weeks, recovered, and returned to his unit in August to find he'd been replaced. His crew had written him off as dead when the tank burned, and a new radio man had taken his position. Dragan was reassigned to a different crew and fought through the rest of the war, surviving battles at Kyiv, Romania, and the final assault on Berlin. In 1996, at a veterans reunion in Moscow, he met the radio man who had replaced him. The replacement had been killed in October 1943 in Ukraine. Dragan attended the man's memorial service and later wrote, "I felt strange attending the funeral of my own replacement, like I was looking at the ghost of what should have been my fate." The human stories from Prokhorovka share common elements. Extreme fear managed through training and adrenaline, split-second decisions with life or death consequences, the randomness of survival, where tiny variations in position or timing determined who lived and who died, and the psychological aftermath that haunted survivors for decades. Medical records from Soviet field hospitals treating Prokhorovka casualties show that 30 to 40% of crew casualties were burns, concentrated primarily among driver and radio operator positions where escape was most difficult. 25% were concussion injuries from non-penetrating hits, shells that didn't pierce armor but created shock waves that fractured skulls, ruptured organs, or caused traumatic brain injuries. The remaining casualties were direct penetration injuries, shell fragments, bullets, and the catastrophic effects of armor-piercing rounds entering crew compartments at supersonic speed. The average age of Soviet tank crew casualties at Prokhorovka was 22 years old. 68% were in their first major battle. Over 4,000 Soviet tankers were killed or wounded on July 12th, most of them in the 5-hour period between 7 a.m. and noon. Their stories, the ones we know, represent a tiny fraction of the individual human tragedies played out that day, in the wheat fields around a railroad junction that most of them had never heard of before receiving their orders to attack it. At 12:30 p.m. on July 12, 1943, SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser sat in his command vehicle 5 kilometers southwest of Prokhorovka, reviewing casualty reports that fundamentally altered his understanding of the battle. The reports, compiled from division returns that were themselves fragmentary and optimistic, indicated 2nd SS Panzer Corps had lost or seriously damaged 42% of its operational armor in 6 hours, 140 tanks destroyed, damaged, or broken down out of 330 that began the day. The loss rate exceeded anything Hauser had experienced in his career, and the implications were immediate and stark. His corps could not continue offensive operations at this attrition rate. More troubling than the numbers were the qualitative details. Leibstandart reported that Tigers were running out of ammunition after 45 minutes of combat, requiring withdrawal to resupply points while fighting continued. Das Reich reported that 60% of its Panthers were non-operational due to mechanical failure, not enemy action. Totenkopf reported being counterattacked by fresh Soviet tank forces that intelligence had assured him didn't exist. Hauser had commanded elite troops in offensive operations for 2 years, and his tactical instinct told him what the reports confirmed. 2nd SS Panzer Corps was fighting not defeated remnants but a full Soviet tank army that outnumbered him and was willing to accept horrific losses to achieve victory. The realization that he was facing 5th Guards tank army rather than defensive remnants forced Hauser to recalculate everything. If German intelligence estimates of Soviet strength were wrong by a factor of 3, estimating 250 tanks when the reality was 672, then what else was wrong? How many other Soviet reserve armies were moving into position? Was Prokhorovka the culminating point of the offensive, or just the beginning of a larger Soviet counteroffensive? Hauser radioed Army Group South headquarters, requesting immediate confirmation of Soviet force estimates and asking for reinforcements. The response, delayed 2 hours by communication problems and staff processing, was devastating. No reinforcements were available. All reserve forces were committed to other sectors, and intelligence stood by its original estimates, despite Hauser's frontline reporting. The response concluded with orders to continue the offensive toward Prokhorovka and to report accurate enemy strength estimates, not inflated figures based on combat stress. At 1 p.m., Rotmistrov faced his own crisis at 5th Guards Tank Army headquarters. His operations officer presented the loss tally with visible distress. 433 tanks destroyed or severely damaged, over 5,000 casualties, including 1,500 dead. The losses exceeded 50% of starting strength in 6 hours of combat, catastrophic by any military standard. Political officers present in the command post were already discussing how to frame the losses in reports to higher headquarters, suggesting language that emphasized German losses and minimized Soviet casualties. Rotmistrov silenced them with a gesture and studied the tactical map. The critical question wasn't the loss rate. Stalin had made clear that any losses were acceptable if they stopped the German offensive, but whether 5th Guards Tank Army retained sufficient combat power to continue operations. The answer, barely, was yes. Approximately 250 Soviet tanks remained operational, less than half of which were 34s capable of fighting German armor effectively. But those 250 tanks still outnumbered operational German armor in the sector, and Soviet artillery was still available to support operations. The decision point came at 1:30 p.m., when news from Italy reached both headquarters almost simultaneously through different channels. The Allies had invaded Sicily on July 10, 2 days earlier, and Italian resistance was collapsing faster than German reinforcements could shore it up. Hitler was meeting with his staff at Rastenburg to decide whether to cancel Citadel and transfer forces to the Mediterranean theater. For Hauser, the Sicily news meant the strategic rationale for Citadel was evaporating. Even if 2nd SS Panzer Corps broke through at Prokhorovka, the forces wouldn't be available to exploit the breakthrough. For Rotmistrov, the Sicily news meant the pressure to achieve decisive results was increasing. If the Germans were distracted by the Mediterranean, this was the moment to crush their offensive capability permanently. Both commanders reached opposite conclusions from the same information. Hauser believed the battle was effectively over, regardless of tactical results, while Rotmistrov believed the battle was entering its decisive phase. At 3:30 p.m., the intensity of fighting began to decrease noticeably across the entire Prokhorovka sector. German forces that had been attacking since dawn pulled back to defensive positions, recovering damaged vehicles, redistributing ammunition, treating casualties. Soviet forces, equally exhausted, didn't pursue aggressively. Commanders, recognizing their units were fought out, their crews reaching the limits of endurance. The battlefield acquired a strange temporary quiet, punctuated by sporadic exchanges between isolated groups, but lacking the sustained violence of the morning hours. Both sides used the lull to evacuate wounded, recover repairable tanks, and reorganize shattered units. German recovery vehicles moved forward under covering fire to retrieve Panthers and Tigers that could be repaired, prioritizing the most expensive and capable vehicles. Soviet recovery teams did the same, focusing on 34s that were damaged but repairable, leaving destroyed hulks for later salvage operations. The casualty statistics from July 12th reveal the brutal mathematics of Prokhorovka. German forces lost approximately 300 killed and 700 wounded, horrific casualties for elite divisions, but sustainable for professional military forces with robust medical support. Soviet forces lost approximately 5,500 killed and 12,000 wounded, catastrophic casualties that destroyed entire battalions and left some brigades combat ineffective. Yet the strategic effect was inverse to the tactical exchange. German forces lost 70 to 80 tanks, completely destroyed, irreplaceable losses, given Germany's limited production capacity and the need to defend multiple fronts. Soviet forces lost 334 tanks, completely destroyed, severe losses, but representing only 1 week of Soviet tank production, replaceable through the industrial base the Soviets had built beyond the Urals. The Germans had won the tactical engagement by any measure of exchange ratios, but lost the operational battle because they couldn't afford their victories, while the Soviets could afford their defeats. The battlefield control situation at day's end revealed the ambiguity of Prokhorovka's outcome. Soviet forces held Prokhorovka itself and the ground immediately around the rail station, Rotmistrov's primary objective. German forces held Storozavoy and several tactically important positions west and south of Prokhorovka, ground they'd seized during the day's fighting. Neither side had achieved their maximum objectives. The Germans hadn't broken through Soviet defenses to achieve operational freedom of maneuver, and the Soviets hadn't destroyed 2nd SS Panzer Corps as a fighting formation. Both sides could claim success, Hauser, in preventing Soviet forces from crushing his corps, Rotmistrov, in preventing German breakthrough, and both claims were simultaneously true and irrelevant to the larger question of whether Citadel would continue. That question was answered at 5 p.m. when Hauser received a coded transmission from Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South. The message was brief and allowed no interpretation. Operations suspended pending Führer decision. Maintain defensive positions. Do not commit reserve forces. Prepare for potential withdrawal to start lines. Hauser showed the message to his operations officer without comment, then issued orders for 2nd SS Panzer Corps to transition to defensive posture. The orders triggered a cascade of adjustments: forward units establishing defensive positions, artillery registering defensive fires on likely approach routes, engineers laying minefields to protect likely avenues of Soviet counterattack. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Soldiers, who had been told they were fighting a decisive offensive battle, now learned they were defending against counterattack, that their casualties had been suffered for objectives that were being abandoned, that the offensive that was supposed to win the war in the East had failed. Soviet intelligence intercepted portions of the German radio traffic about suspending operations and correctly interpreted it as strategic success. Vatutin sent a message to Rotmistrov at 6 p.m. Congratulations on defeating enemy tank attack. Hold current positions. Prepare for transition to counteroffensive operations. Rotmistrov read the message to his assembled staff, and for the first time in 72 hours, allowed himself to believe 5th Guards Tank Army had accomplished its mission. The cost had been catastrophic, the battle closer to disaster than triumph, but the strategic objective had been achieved. The German offensive was stopped. When news of the victory spread through Soviet units, reactions were mixed. Veteran crews who had survived the battle felt primarily relief at being alive and grief for fallen comrades. Political officers attempted to frame the battle as a great victory, demonstrating Soviet superiority, but survivors who had seen the German tanks destroy Soviet armor at will weren't convinced. Junior commanders who had watched their units destroyed were haunted by the question of whether better tactics could have reduced losses, a question that would trouble some of them for the rest of their lives. The breaking point at Prokhorovka wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a gradual realization on both sides that continuing the battle served no purpose. For the Germans, the breaking point came when Hauser acknowledged he was fighting the wrong battle, attacking when he should have been preparing for defense against Soviet counteroffensives. For the Soviets, the breaking point came when Rotmistrov recognized his army couldn't sustain another day of combat at July 12th's intensity. A second day of similar losses would have reduced 5th Guards Tank Army to combat ineffectiveness. Both commanders made rational calculations based on incomplete information and conflicting pressures, and both reached conclusions that ended the battle without either side being routed or destroyed. The result was a draw that favored the defender, which in this case was the Soviet side regardless of loss ratios. Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, demonstrated that modern industrial warfare creates conditions where tactical victories become strategic defeats, where the side that loses more can still achieve its objectives, and where the breaking point is determined less by casualties than by the relationship between losses and strategic purpose. Neither Hauser nor Rotmistrov fully understood these dynamics as they made their decisions that evening, but their instincts led them to conclusions that history would validate. The battle was over, though the dying would continue for hours as wounded men succumbed to injuries and disabled tanks burned through the night. The dawn of July 13, 1943, revealed Prokhorovka's battlefield in full horror for the first time. The morning light illuminating a landscape transformed into an industrial graveyard stretching across 15 square kilometers. Soviet recovery crews moving forward at first light counted 846 destroyed or abandoned tanks, both German and Soviet, scattered across wheat fields that had been trampled into mud by thousands of tank tracks. The hulks were still burning in many cases, columns of black smoke rising vertically in the still morning air, the smell of burning rubber, diesel fuel, and human flesh, creating a stench that recovery personnel wrapped cloth around their faces to endure. Many tanks contained crew remains, bodies burned beyond recognition, sometimes fused to metal surfaces by the intense heat of ammunition fires that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Recovery team leaders made the grim calculation that approximately 40% of the destroyed tanks still contained dead crew members, meaning over 300 bodies would need to be extracted from burned-out hulks before the vehicles could be salvaged. The recovery operations themselves were dangerous and traumatic work. Soviet crews used tractors to tow damaged 34s to collection points where specialized maintenance units assessed whether vehicles could be repaired or should be stripped for parts. German recovery teams conducted similar operations with their Panthers and Tigers, prioritizing the most valuable and repairable vehicles. Both sides worked under sporadic artillery fire, Soviet guns harassing German recovery operations, German guns doing the same to Soviet efforts, creating the absurd situation where recovery crews were being killed trying to salvage the machines that had failed to kill each other the previous day. A Soviet tractor crew attempting to recover a disabled 34 was killed when German artillery scored a direct hit on their vehicle. A German recovery team extracting a Panther with transmission failure was forced to abandon the operation when Soviet tanks appeared on the ridgeline and began engaging at long range. The medical toll revealed itself more slowly as field hospitals processed the flood of casualties from July 12th. Soviet Field Hospital No. 43, located 40 kilometers behind the lines near Kurokha, received over 1,200 wounded in the first 24 hours after the battle. The hospital's normal capacity was 300 patients, and the staff of 18 doctors and 70 nurses was overwhelmed immediately. Surgical teams worked 18-hour shifts, performing amputations, treating burns, and attempting to save men with abdominal or chest wounds that in many cases were beyond the hospital's capability to treat. The hospital had adequate supplies of morphine and basic surgical instruments, but lacked blood plasma, antibiotics, which were rare in the Soviet medical system, and specialized equipment for treating severe burns. The mortality rate among hospitalized Soviet wounded from Prokhorovka exceeded 30%, compared to approximately 12% for German wounded, who received treatment in better-equipped hospitals farther from the front. The burn casualties presented the most challenging medical cases and the most horrific suffering. Tank fires created by burning fuel and ammunition reached temperatures that caused fourth-degree burns, destruction of all skin layers, plus underlying tissue and bone. Crew members who escaped burning tanks often had burns covering 30 to 60% of their body surface, concentrated on hands and faces that had been exposed while they climbed out of hatches. Soviet field hospitals had minimal burn treatment capability beyond cleaning wounds, administering morphine, and waiting to see if infection would kill the patient. A significant percentage of burn victims who survived the initial injury died within 2 weeks from infections that 19th-century medicine could have prevented. Pavel Vasilyev, the driver who survived 3 tank knockouts, spent 3 weeks in Field Hospital No. 43, with burns covering 40% of his body, primarily on his hands, arms, and back. He survived without antibiotics through a combination of youth, luck, and a robust immune system, but 60% of the burn patients admitted with him died. The official casualty accounting revealed systematic efforts by both sides to minimize reported losses while inflating enemy casualties. A Soviet political officer compiling the 5th Guards Tank Army Loss Report on July 15th received explicit instructions from Front Political Department to categorize losses in ways that obscured the true scale of the disaster. Tanks that broke down during the approach march were listed as operational losses rather than combat losses, reducing the apparent casualties from the battle itself. Tanks damaged but theoretically repairable were listed as temporary casualties, even if repairs would take months and require complete rebuilding. The initial report submitted to Stalin on July 17th claimed 5th Guards Tank Army had destroyed over 400 German tanks while losing fewer than 200 Soviet tanks, figures that bore almost no relationship to reality but served political purposes. The actual Soviet losses were 334 tanks completely destroyed, plus over 400 damaged, while German losses were 70 to 80 tanks destroyed, plus approximately 150 damaged. German casualty reporting was more accurate numerically, but still shaped by institutional biases and propaganda requirements. Unit commanders filed reports claiming higher kill ratios than evidence supported, partly because tank crews genuinely couldn't distinguish their kills from those of other German tanks in the confusion, partly because commanders knew their careers depended on demonstrating success. A Leibstandart after-action report claimed 192 Soviet tanks destroyed on July 12th, a figure derived by adding all kill claims from all units, many of which had claimed the same tanks destroyed by multiple crews. Post-war analysis using Soviet loss reports suggests the actual number of Soviet tanks destroyed by Leibstandart was closer to 120, still impressive, but 40% lower than the claimed figure. The tendency to overclaim was universal, not unique to Germans, but German overclaiming at Prokhorovka contributed to post-war myths about the battle that persisted for decades. Stalin received the full reports on Prokhorovka on July 20th during a Stavka meeting at the Kremlin, and his reaction revealed the complex political calculations surrounding the battle. He praised Rotmistrov for defeating the enemy tank attack and preventing German breakthrough, but he also questioned the casualty figures and demanded explanation for why losses were so high if the victory was so decisive. Rotmistrov, summoned to Moscow for personal debriefing, provided an honest assessment that emphasized German technological superiority, the difficulty of close assault tactics, and the determination of German resistance. Stalin listened without interrupting, asked detailed questions about tank versus tank engagements, and ultimately accepted Rotmistrov's explanation. Critically, Stalin did not punish Rotmistrov for the losses, a decision that surprised many observers who expected the dictator to make an example of a commander who had suffered such casualties. The decision to retain Rotmistrov reflected Stalin's learning curve about military reality. By 1943, he had begun to understand that victory against Germany required accepting casualties that would have been unthinkable to Western Allied commanders. The recovery of remains from destroyed tanks continued through late July and into August, a grim task that fell primarily to combat engineers and penal battalions. The process involved using crowbars to pry open hatches welded shut by heat, extracting bodies that had been dead for weeks in summer temperatures, attempting to identify remains through dog tags or personal effects when bodies were burned beyond recognition. Of the estimated 3,200 Soviet tankers killed at Prokhorovka on July 12th, approximately 1,800 bodies were recovered and identified well enough for burial with name markers. The remaining 1,400 were buried in mass graves marked only as unknown Soviet soldiers. German casualties were handled similarly, approximately 300 German tankers killed at Prokhorovka, with 240 identified and buried in military cemeteries. The remaining 60 buried as unknowns. The mass graves at Prokhorovka became the physical evidence of the battle's cost, rows of wooden markers in fields near the battlefield testifying to lives ended in a single day's fighting. Soviet authorities established a military cemetery 2 kilometers east of Prokhorovka station, where over 4,000 Soviet soldiers killed in the Kursk battles were buried, the majority from 5th Guards Tank Army. The cemetery was maintained by the state and in later decades became a pilgrimage site for veterans and families seeking graves of relatives. German dead were initially buried in field cemeteries near their units, later concentrated in larger German military cemeteries, and after the war, many were moved to central German war cemeteries, maintained by the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge. The physical separation of the dead, Soviet and German, buried in different locations, honored by different ceremonies, remembered in different narratives, reflected the political division that would characterize the Cold War and ensure Prokhorovka's story would be told differently depending on which side was telling it. The salvage operations that extended through August recovered 320 Soviet tanks for repair and 84 German tanks for repair, figures that indicated both the intensity of the battle and the different approaches to battlefield recovery. Soviet forces controlled Prokhorovka and the surrounding area, allowing extensive recovery operations. German forces withdrew from forward positions in late July, abandoning disabled vehicles they couldn't recover. The recovered tanks required varying degrees of repair. Some needed only new tracks or minor mechanical work. Others required complete rebuilds that took months, and essentially meant scrapping everything except the hull and building a new tank around it. The repair facilities in the Soviet rear were operating at maximum capacity, processing damaged tanks from Prokhorovka alongside vehicles damaged in other sectors of the Kursk battle. Repair crews worked around the clock, cannibalizing unrepairable hulks for parts, improvising solutions when proper replacement components weren't available. By late July, 5th Guards Tank Army had been rebuilt to approximately 60% of its pre-battle strength through a combination of repaired vehicles and replacements shipped from factories. The rebuilt army participated in the Soviet Rumyantsev counteroffensive that began on August 3rd, attacking the same German forces that had fought at Prokhorovka, but now without their best units, which Hitler had transferred to Italy. The fact that 5th Guards Tank Army could be reconstituted and committed to offensive operations within 3 weeks of suffering catastrophic losses demonstrated the fundamental asymmetry between German and Soviet war economies. Germany had won the tactical battle at Prokhorovka by any measure of loss exchange, but the victory was meaningless because Soviet productive capacity could replace losses while German capacity could not. The counting of the dead revealed not just the human cost, but the mathematical inevitability of German defeat in a war of attrition against an enemy with larger population, greater industrial base, and political system willing to accept casualties that would have toppled democratic governments. Adolf Hitler sat in the conference room at his Rastenburg headquarters in East Prussia on July 13, 1943, reviewing reports from the Eastern Front with visible agitation that his staff recognized as the prelude to a decision none of them wanted to hear. The reports detailed the situation at Kursk, 6 days of offensive operations that had advanced 35 kilometers in the south and barely 10 kilometers in the north, casualties exceeding projections, Soviet resistance far stronger than intelligence estimates suggested. But the reports from Italy were worse. The Anglo-American invasion of Sicily on July 10th had triggered the collapse of Italian coastal defenses faster than anyone had predicted. 6 Italian divisions had surrendered en masse. German reinforcements were rushing to Sicily, but couldn't stem the Allied advance without substantial additional forces. Benito Mussolini's government was teetering, and if Italy left the war, Germany's entire southern flank would collapse. Hitler faced the decision that would define the remainder of the Eastern Front war: continue Citadel despite mounting costs and diminishing prospects, or cancel the offensive and transfer forces to defend Italy. The meeting that decided Citadel's fate began at 10 a.m. and lasted 3 hours, featuring the most heated debate among German high command since the decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group Center in the north, argued for immediate cancellation of Citadel, emphasizing that his forces had suffered 12,000 casualties for minimal gains and that continuing the offensive would only increase losses without achieving objectives. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, argued vehemently for continuation, insisting that his forces were on the verge of breakthrough and that one more major push could encircle Soviet forces in the Salient. Manstein claimed correctly that Soviet forces at Prokhorovka had suffered far higher casualties than German forces, and he interpreted this as evidence the Soviets were near collapse. What Manstein didn't know, because German intelligence had failed completely, was that Soviet reserves were moving into position for major counteroffensives that would begin regardless of whether Citadel continued. Hitler's decision reflected his growing detachment from military reality and his increasing focus on political and propaganda considerations over operational logic. At 1 p.m., he announced that Citadel would be suspended, not officially canceled, but effectively terminated, and that 2nd SS Panzer Corps would be transferred to Italy within days to prevent Italian collapse. The decision was militarily irrational from an Eastern Front perspective. It abandoned an offensive after suffering all the costs, but before achieving any of the objectives, it ceded initiative to the Soviets permanently, and it validated the Soviet defensive strategy of allowing German attacks to exhaust themselves on prepared defenses. But from Hitler's broader strategic perspective, the decision made sense. Losing Italy would expose Germany's southern flank and potentially allow Allied invasion of the Balkans or southern France, creating a two-front war in the West that Germany absolutely could not afford. Manstein protested the decision with unusual vehemence, arguing directly with Hitler in language that would have resulted in dismissal for any less essential commander. He pointed out that transferring 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the strongest formation in Army Group South, would guarantee that the defensive positions his forces currently held couldn't be maintained against inevitable Soviet counterattacks. He predicted, with perfect accuracy, that canceling Citadel would result in Soviet counteroffensives that would drive German forces back to their start lines within weeks and potentially farther. He demanded that if forces were being transferred to Italy, they should come from quiet sectors or from the west, not from the one sector where German forces were actively engaged. Hitler refused all arguments, and the meeting ended with Manstein submitting to the decision while making clear his opposition for the record. The orders to suspend Citadel and begin withdrawals reached 2nd SS Panzer Corps headquarters on July 15th, 2 days after Hauser had already transitioned to defensive operations following the Prokhorovka battle. For German troops who had fought for 10 days believing they were conducting a decisive offensive, the news that the operation was canceled was devastating to morale. Soldiers who had watched comrades die, capturing particular villages or hills, now learned those positions would be abandoned, that the sacrifices had achieved nothing permanent, that the offensive everyone had been told would win the war had simply stopped without achieving breakthrough. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. Junior officers reported increased desertion rates, declining combat motivation, and a pervasive sense that Germany was no longer capable of winning the war, but only of delaying defeat. Soviet intelligence learned of Citadel's suspension through multiple channels: signals, intercepts, agent reports from sources inside the Wehrmacht, and aerial reconnaissance showing German forces beginning withdrawal movements. Stalin received confirmation on July 16th, and immediately ordered preparation for major counteroffensives to exploit German weakness. The counteroffensive planning had begun weeks earlier. As part of the overall Kursk defensive concept, let the Germans exhaust themselves attacking, then crush them with fresh reserves when they were weakest. The Rumyantsev offensive, targeting Belgorod and Kharkov, would begin on August 3rd. The Kutuzov offensive, targeting Orel, would begin on July 15th. Combined, the two offensives would involve over 2 million Soviet troops, 8,000 tanks, and 30,000 artillery pieces, the largest Soviet offensive operations of the war to date. The force transfers that followed Hitler's decision reshaped the entire Eastern Front's balance. 2nd SS Panzer Corps began movement to Italy on July 20th, stripping Army Group South of its most powerful armored formation. 1st Panzer Division transferred west. Multiple infantry divisions were pulled from the Kursk sector for Italy or to rebuild depleted units elsewhere. Within 3 weeks, Army Group South had lost approximately 40% of its armored strength and 30% of its infantry from the forces that had begun Citadel. German commanders attempted to establish defensive positions with remaining forces, but the math was impossible: fewer troops defending longer lines against an enemy who now held absolute initiative. The defensive positions that might have been sustainable in mid-July became untenable by early August when Soviet counteroffensives began. The Rumyantsev offensive, launched on August 3rd, demonstrated how completely the strategic initiative had shifted. Soviet forces, including 5th Guards Tank Army, rebuilt after Prokhorovka, attacked the same German positions that had been assault objectives during Citadel, but now defended by forces depleted through attrition and transfers. The offensive used the same basic approach that had succeeded defensively at Kursk: massive artillery preparation, breakthrough with infantry and armor, exploitation with tank armies pushing into operational depths. German forces fought skillful defensive actions but couldn't hold against numerical superiority when their best units were gone. Belgorod fell to Soviet forces on August 5th. Kharkov, the city that had changed hands 4 times already in the war, fell on August 23rd, after 2 weeks of brutal urban fighting. The liberation of Kharkov, exactly 6 weeks after Prokhorovka, achieved the strategic objective that stopping the German offensive at Prokhorovka had made possible. The casualty statistics for the entire Kursk operation, defensive phase, and counteroffensive combined revealed the obscene costs of industrial warfare on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces suffered approximately 860,000 casualties, including 254,000 killed in the defensive and offensive phases combined. The number was staggering more than the United States would lose, killed in the entire war, yet represented less than 5% of Soviet military manpower, and was considered acceptable given the strategic results. German forces suffered approximately 200,000 casualties, including 54,000 killed, figures that were proportionally far lower than Soviet losses, but strategically unsustainable. Germany in 1943 had approximately 13 million men under arms total across all fronts. Losing 200,000 of the most experienced troops in a single operation was a hemorrhage the Wehrmacht couldn't afford and couldn't replace with equivalent quality. The strategic shift after Kursk was permanent and irreversible. Before Citadel, Germany maintained the theoretical capability to conduct major offensive operations on the Eastern Front, choosing when and where to attack based on operational considerations. After Citadel, Germany never again mounted a major strategic offensive in the East. All subsequent operations were reactive, defensive, or limited counterattacks responding to Soviet initiatives. The Red Army seized and never relinquished strategic initiative, conducting continuous offensive operations from August 1943 until Victory in Europe Day in May 1945. The shift wasn't primarily due to Prokhorovka itself. The battle was one component of the larger Kursk defensive operation, but Prokhorovka symbolized the shift because it was the largest single tank engagement and because it demonstrated that German technological superiority couldn't overcome Soviet numerical superiority and operational competence. The question that military historians would debate for decades was whether Prokhorovka actually stopped Citadel or whether the Sicily invasion and Hitler's decision to transfer forces were the decisive factors. The evidence suggests both factors were necessary, and neither alone would have been sufficient. Prokhorovka and the broader Kursk defensive operation inflicted sufficient casualties on German forces that continuing Citadel became increasingly difficult. German armor strength declined daily through combat losses and mechanical attrition, and Soviet resistance showed no signs of collapsing. But the Sicily invasion created the political crisis that forced Hitler to choose between continuing an increasingly costly offensive in the East or preventing catastrophe in the Mediterranean. The combination of military reality at the front and political crisis away from the front created conditions where canceling Citadel was the least bad option available to Hitler. The irony that Prokhorovka's architects couldn't have foreseen was that the battle's strategic importance came from what it prevented rather than what it achieved. If 2nd SS Panzer Corps had broken through at Prokhorovka on July 12th, the operational situation would have been serious for Voronezh Front, but not catastrophic for Soviet strategic planning. Soviet reserves were sufficient to contain even a major German breakthrough, and the Sicily invasion would still have forced German force transfers regardless of tactical success at Prokhorovka. But by stopping the German advance, by forcing 2nd SS Panzer Corps into defensive posture, by demonstrating that German offensive operations couldn't achieve decisive results even with technological superiority, Prokhorovka validated the Soviet defensive concept and confirmed that the Red Army had evolved from the disorganized force of 1941 into a professional military capable of defeating Wehrmacht attacks through preparation and determination. The turning point at Kursk wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a gradual realization on both sides that the war's trajectory had shifted irrevocably in the Soviet Union's favor, and Prokhorovka was the most visible single battle in that larger shift. In a modest office in Moscow during the third week of August 1943, Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov sat at a desk writing the after-action report that would reshape Soviet armored warfare doctrine for the remainder of the war. The document, eventually running to 73 pages with detailed appendices, was remarkable for its brutal honesty about 5th Guards Tank Army's performance at Prokhorovka, honesty that was professionally dangerous in Stalin's Soviet Union, where admitting failure often resulted in imprisonment or execution. Rotmistrov documented the catastrophic losses, the tactical mistakes that amplified casualties, the inadequacy of close assault tactics against dug-in German armor, and the fundamental problem that 34 76mm guns couldn't penetrate Tiger and Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. He recommended sweeping changes to Soviet tank tactics, never again charge dug-in German armor without extensive artillery preparation, emphasize combined arms coordination over mass tank attacks, improve reconnaissance to identify German positions before committing forces, and, most critically, develop new tanks capable of engaging Tigers and Panthers at range rather than requiring suicidal close assaults. The political risk Rotmistrov accepted in writing such a critical report was substantial, but he calculated correctly that the Red Army's institutional culture had evolved by 1943 to value learning over blame. The catastrophic defeats of 1941 had taught Stalin and his senior commanders that shooting generals for telling uncomfortable truths simply ensured future generals would lie, creating an information cascade that guaranteed more disasters. Rotmistrov's report circulated through the military hierarchy, eventually reaching Stalin's desk, and the dictator's response surprised many observers. Stalin approved the report's distribution to all tank army and corps commanders as a training document. More significantly, Stalin ordered the Red Army's Armored Forces Directorate to implement Rotmistrov's recommended tactical reforms and to accelerate development of improved tanks that could fight German heavy armor on equal terms. The tank development response to Prokhorovka was already underway before Rotmistrov's report, but his documentation of the 34's limitations provided bureaucratic ammunition for designers who had been arguing for an upgraded medium tank. Alexander Morozov's design bureau in the Urals had been working since early 1943 on enlarging the 34's turret to mount an 85mm gun, a weapon powerful enough to penetrate Panther frontal armor at 500 meters and Tiger frontal armor at 800 meters. The original 34's turret was too small for the larger gun, requiring a complete redesign that increased turret ring diameter from 1420 millimeters to 1600 millimeters. The larger turret required strengthening the hull, which increased weight from 26 tons to 32 tons, which required upgrading the engine and transmission to maintain mobility. The result was effectively a new tank that shared only general configuration with the original 34. The bureaucratic approval process for the 3485, normally a lengthy procedure involving multiple committees and political approval, was compressed into weeks because of Prokhorovka's lessons. Morozov's team completed prototype trials in December 1943, demonstrating that the 85mm gun could destroy captured Panthers at ranges the original 34 couldn't match. Stalin personally reviewed the prototype during a demonstration at Kubinka Proving Grounds and approved immediate production with the terse comment, "Why didn't we have this at Kursk?" Production began in February 1944, and by March, the first 3485s were reaching frontline units. The production ramp was impressive by June 1944. Soviet factories were producing more 3485s than original 34s, and by war's end, over 25,000 of the improved model had been built. The tactical reforms recommended by Rotmistrov were implemented through revised field regulations published in September 1943 and reinforced through intensive training programs for tank unit commanders. The new doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination at all levels tank attacks, supported by artillery, suppressing anti-tank defenses, infantry clearing German infantry from positions before tanks advanced, airstrikes on German armor concentrations before ground attacks commenced. The doctrine reduced tank-to-infantry ratios in tank armies from 3:1 to approximately 1:1, integrating far more motorized rifle units into formations that had previously been tank-heavy. Artillery support increased by approximately 40%, with tank armies receiving dedicated artillery brigades rather than relying on front-level artillery allocated mission by mission. The changes transformed Soviet tank armies from the cavalry substitute forces of 1941 into mechanized combined arms formations that resembled modern armored divisions. The most significant tactical change was the abandonment of massed frontal attacks in favor of infiltration and maneuver. Pre-Prokhorovka Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming attacks on narrow frontages, getting inside the enemy's decision cycle through speed and violence, even if casualties were high. Post-Prokhorovka doctrine emphasized reconnaissance to identify weak points, concentration of force against those weak points rather than attacking everywhere simultaneously, and infiltration through gaps to attack German positions from flanks and rear. The new approach was visible in the Korsun-Cherkasy operation in January-February 1944, where Soviet tank armies encircled German forces through maneuver rather than attempting frontal breakthrough, achieving strategic results with far lower casualties than earlier operations would have cost. Rotmistrov himself benefited professionally from his honesty about Prokhorovka's problems. Rather than being punished for the heavy losses, he was promoted to Marshal of Armored Troops in February 1944 and assigned to command all Soviet armored and mechanized forces as deputy to the People's Commissar of Defense. The promotion reflected Stalin's recognition that the Red Army needed commanders who could learn from failure and implement improvements, not yes-men who would claim every operation was a perfect victory. Rotmistrov used his expanded authority to accelerate tactical reforms across all Soviet armored forces, establishing training centers where commanders could practice combined arms operations and study German defensive tactics without the pressure of combat. The German response to Prokhorovka was paradoxically less adaptive, despite their military culture's emphasis on tactical excellence. German commanders correctly identified that they had won the tactical engagement through superior equipment and crew training, and they drew the lesson that their approach was sound but needed more resources. The German tank development response focused on building even heavier tanks, the Panther II, the King Tiger with its 128mm gun, the Super Heavy Mouse at 180 tons, rather than recognizing that the strategic situation required producible medium tanks in large numbers. The King Tiger was undeniably the most powerful tank of the war, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, but Germany built fewer than 500 compared to over 40,000 34s of all variants. The German approach exemplified the fallacy of perfection over adequacy, building ever better tanks in ever smaller numbers, while the Soviets built good enough tanks in overwhelming numbers. The production comparison between Soviet and German tank industries in 1944 demonstrated how completely the strategic balance had shifted. Soviet factories produced approximately 29,000 tanks in 1944, including significant numbers of the improved 34, 85, and IS-2 heavy tanks. German factories produced approximately 19,000 tanks and assault guns despite heroic efforts by Armaments Minister Albert Speer to increase output. The Soviet advantage was growing, not shrinking, and the quality gap was closing as improved Soviet designs matched German technical capabilities while maintaining producibility advantages. By mid-1944, a Soviet tank army equipped with 34, 85s, and IS-2s could fight German armored formations on relatively equal tactical terms, while enjoying overwhelming numerical superiority. The human learning from Prokhorovka was visible in veteran crews who survived the battle and fought in subsequent operations. Tank commanders who had experienced the horror of charging German positions without adequate support became adamant about proper preparation for attacks. Drivers who had seen their friends burned alive in tanks developed superstitious rituals about escape route planning and hatch maintenance. Gunners who had fired uselessly at Tigers from ranges where their guns couldn't penetrate learned to wait for flanking shots or close to point-blank range before engaging heavy German armor. The accumulated tactical knowledge of survivors was transmitted informally through the Red Army's replacement system, creating a body of practical expertise that no field manual could fully capture. The long-term impact of Prokhorovka's lessons extended beyond the Eastern Front to influence post-war Soviet military doctrine and even affected how modern armored forces train and fight. The emphasis on combined arms, the recognition that technological superiority alone doesn't guarantee victory, the willingness to trade casualties for strategic objectives all became permanent features of Soviet and later Russian military culture. Western military analysts studying Soviet doctrine in the Cold War era identified Prokhorovka as the crucible where the Red Army learned lessons that shaped its approach to mechanized warfare for generations. The question of whether those lessons were the right lessons, whether accepting catastrophic casualties to achieve objectives was militarily necessary or a product of a political system indifferent to human life, remained contested. What was undeniable was that the Red Army that fought at Prokhorovka in July 1943 was qualitatively different from the Red Army that liberated Warsaw in January 1945, and the difference came from learning purchased with blood on the wheat fields around a railroad junction that most of the students never lived to see again. On a warm summer day in 1995, exactly 52 years after the battle, 73-year-old Anatoly Kozlov stood on the hillside east of Prokhorovka, where his 34 had been destroyed on July 12, 1943, and broke down crying for the first time since the war ended. Kozlov had been a 19-year-old driver in the 31st Tank Brigade, and his tank had taken a Panther round through the engine compartment at approximately 8:30 a.m., forcing the crew to bail out while the vehicle burned. 3 of his 4 crewmates survived that day, but all 3 had died in subsequent battles before the war ended. The commander at Kiev in November 43, the gunner during the Lvov-Sandomierz operation in summer 44, the loader at Budapest in winter 45. Kozlov alone survived the war, returned to his village in Ukraine, worked in agriculture, married, raised children, and never spoke about the war in detail to anyone. He had refused all invitations to veterans' reunions, declined interviews from historians, and avoided anything that might force him to remember. But in '95, his grandson, a university student studying history, asked him to return to Prokhorovka for a school project. Standing on the battlefield for the first time since he fled it as a teenager, Kozlov could no longer maintain the emotional walls he'd constructed. The 1998 meeting between Franz Staudinger and Viktor Bryukov at the Russian Military Academy in Moscow was arranged by a German-Russian Veterans Reconciliation Organization and proved far more emotional than either elderly man anticipated. Staudinger, the Panther commander who claimed 22 kills at Prokhorovka, had become a minor celebrity in Germany as one of the Wehrmacht's tank aces, featured in books and documentaries about German armor. Bryukov was a Soviet 34 commander who had fought in the same sector where Staudinger operated, though neither man could confirm they had directly engaged each other. The 2 veterans, both in their mid-70s, met awkwardly, neither certain what to say to someone they had tried to kill 55 years earlier. The conversation started stiffly, conducted through translators, focusing on technical details of tanks and tactics, safe topics that avoided the human cost. But gradually, the conversation shifted to shared experiences. The terror of being under fire, the guilt of surviving when friends didn't, the nightmares that persisted decades after the war. Staudinger admitted that his kill claims were probably inflated, that in the chaos he couldn't be certain which destroyed tanks were his and which were killed by other German tanks. Bryukov acknowledged that Soviet propaganda had exaggerated German losses, that the victory at Prokhorovka had been much more costly and less decisive than official histories claimed. The psychological toll of Prokhorovka on veterans became a subject of academic study only in the 1990s after the Soviet Union's collapse allowed more open discussion of wartime experiences. Soviet veterans had received essentially no psychological care. After the war, the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't recognized in Soviet medicine, and admitting to psychological problems was politically dangerous in a system that valorized toughness and dismissed mental health concerns as bourgeois weakness. Pavel Vasilyev, the driver who survived 3 tank knockouts and severe burns, suffered recurring nightmares for 40 years after the war. The nightmares followed consistent patterns: being trapped in a burning tank unable to escape, watching crew members die while being unable to help them, hearing the sound of shells impacting armor. Vasilyev never sought treatment because Soviet society provided no acceptable framework for veterans to discuss psychological trauma. The nightmares only stopped after he participated in a 1995 reconciliation visit to Germany, where he met German veterans and, for the first time, discussed his experiences openly with people who understood. The cathartic effect of that conversation, being able to acknowledge his trauma to people who shared similar experiences, provided more healing than 40 years of repression had. The 2000 reunion at Prokhorovka for the 57th anniversary of the battle drew 12 surviving veterans of 5th Guards Tank Army, 12 out of approximately 20,000 men who had fought in the formation on July 12, 43. The veterans, all in their late 70s or 80s, arrived from across the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, many traveling for days by train because they couldn't afford air travel on their meager pensions. The reunion was organized by a veterans organization with minimal government support, held in a modest community center rather than the elaborate official ceremonies that had characterized earlier anniversaries when hundreds of veterans attended. The 12 survivors spent 2 days sharing stories, visiting the battlefield, and attending a memorial service at the military cemetery. What struck younger observers at the reunion was the complex mixture of emotions the veterans displayed: pride in having fought and survived, grief for fallen comrades, bitterness about how the Soviet government had forgotten them in the post-Soviet era, and a surprising lack of hatred toward their former German enemies. Mikhail Borisov died in 2010 at age 93, the last surviving Tiger commander from Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division who had fought at Prokhorovka. His final interview, recorded 3 weeks before his death, provided insights into how German veterans process their Prokhorovka experiences differently than Soviet veterans. Borisov had been a 22-year-old SS lieutenant in July 43, a true believer in National Socialism who volunteered for the Waffen-SS and considered military service a sacred duty. The war's outcome and the Holocaust's revelation forced him to fundamentally reassess his younger self's beliefs, a psychological process that took decades. By the time of his final interview, Borisov described his wartime self as a different person, someone I don't recognize, and he expressed profound shame about his SS service while maintaining pride in his crew's technical proficiency. He estimated his Tiger destroyed 8 to 12 Soviet tanks at Prokhorovka, far fewer than wartime claims, but still significant, and he described the battle as the day I realized we were going to lose the war because the Prokhorovka, seemingly endless waves of Soviet tanks demonstrated that German technical superiority couldn't overcome Soviet numerical strength and determination. The memory variation between German and Soviet veterans' accounts of Prokhorovka created significant challenges for historians trying to establish accurate narratives. German veterans' accounts, when checked against archival records after Soviet archives opened in the 1990s, generally aligned with documentary evidence on issues like unit locations, timing of engagements, and German casualty figures. Soviet veterans' accounts showed significant discrepancies with archival records, particularly regarding German losses and Soviet tactical successes. A common pattern in Soviet veteran interviews from the 1980s was claiming 400 or more German tanks destroyed the official propaganda figure, even though archival evidence showed actual German losses were under 80. When confronted with archival evidence in the 1990s, some Soviet veterans acknowledged their memories had been shaped by propaganda, while others insisted the archives must be wrong because they remembered seeing hundreds of destroyed German tanks. The divergence reflected both the malleability of memory and the power of political narratives to reshape personal recollection. The cross-border veteran connections that developed in the 1990s created unexpected emotional bonds between former enemies. A particularly poignant example was the relationship between Alexander Belly, the 34 commander who rammed a Tiger, and the family of the Tiger commander he had fought. The German commander, whose name was Herbert Müller, died during the ramming incident's hand-to-hand combat aftermath, killed by Soviet infantry before German forces could rescue him. Belly learned Müller's identity only in 1997, when German and Russian historians matched their after-action reports. Müller's son, who had been 3 years old when his father died, contacted Belly through a veterans organization, and the two men began a correspondence that lasted until Belly's death in 2003. Belly described the ramming and subsequent fighting in detail, providing Müller's son with information about his father's final moments that the official death notification had never contained. Müller's son traveled to Prokhorovka in 2002, and Belly took him to the approximate location where the ramming occurred, a moment both men later described as achieving a sense of closure about events that had haunted their families for 6 decades. The monument politics at Prokhorovka revealed how memory of the battle served different purposes across different eras. The main memorial, a bell tower erected in 1973 for the 30th anniversary, featured inscriptions claiming, "Here the fascist hordes were decisively defeated, and 400 fascist tanks destroyed," propaganda claims that bore no relationship to historical reality. Soviet veterans attending ceremonies at the memorial in the 1970s and 80s knew the inscriptions were false, but stayed silent about the discrepancies because challenging official narratives was dangerous. After the Soviet Union's collapse, some historians advocated updating the memorial's inscriptions to reflect accurate casualty figures. But veterans' organizations resisted, arguing that the memorial honored the dead regardless of its historical inaccuracies, and that changing inscriptions dishonored those who had believed the original narrative. The compromise reached in the 2000s was to erect additional memorials with more accurate historical information, while leaving the 1973 memorial unchanged as a historical artifact reflecting Soviet era. Memory of the battle. By 2010, the population of Prokhorovka veterans had dwindled to approximately 40 surviving combatants from both sides, 40 men out of the roughly 29,000 who had fought there 67 years earlier. The demographic reality meant that within a decade, no living witnesses to the battle would remain, and Prokhorovka would transition from living memory to history. The last survivors were acutely aware of their role as final witnesses, and many granted interviews or wrote memoirs in their final years, motivated by desire to correct historical record or to ensure their fallen comrades weren't forgotten. Common themes in these final testimonies included acknowledgement that official narratives on both sides had distorted what happened, respect for the courage and skill of opponents despite the ideological hatred that fueled the war, survivors' guilt that intensified rather than faded with age, and a desire for younger generations to understand the horror of industrial warfare so they wouldn't repeat it. The voices from Prokhorovka's future, the veterans speaking decades after the battle, provided insights that contemporary accounts couldn't capture, perspective that only came from surviving the war, building lives in peacetime, and reflecting across decades on what they had experienced in one day's horror on the wheat fields around a Russian railroad junction. On a cold Moscow morning in November 1991, American historian David Glantz walked through the doors of the Russian State Military Archive in Podolsk for the first time and experienced what he would later describe as entering a historical treasure vault that had been sealed for 50 years. The archive, known by its Russian acronym TSAMO, contained over 20 million documents from the Soviet military dating back to the Russian Civil War, including comprehensive records from the Great Patriotic War that had been classified and inaccessible to Western scholars throughout the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union 3 months earlier had created a brief window of unprecedented openness before Russian authorities reconsidered allowing unrestricted foreign access to sensitive military records. Glantz and a small group of Western military historians rushed to exploit the opportunity, arriving with lists of key battles they hoped to research and recording equipment to capture as much information as possible before the archive's policies inevitably tightened. Prokhorovka was high on every historian's priority list because the battle had been so central to Soviet propaganda, yet so poorly documented in Western sources. The initial discoveries in the archives were simultaneously thrilling and disturbing. Unit war diaries, loss reports, and after-action documents painted a picture of Prokhorovka that diverged dramatically from both Soviet propaganda and German accounts. Soviet losses were higher than even pessimistic Western estimates had suggested. The actual figure of 334 tanks destroyed on July 12 alone, plus over 400 damaged, dwarfed the official Soviet history, claiming approximately 200 lost. German losses were lower than Soviet wartime claims, but higher than some German. Post-war memoirs suggested the archives confirmed 70, 80 German tanks completely destroyed, rather than the 400 Soviet propaganda claimed, but also revealed that German damaged vehicles often required months of repair and effectively represented permanent losses from the Kursk operation. The casualty figures were equally shocking. Soviet personnel losses of approximately 5,500 killed and over 12,000 wounded in a single day's fighting exceeded the total American combat deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan combined across 20 years of conflict. The 1997 publication of research by Russian historian Valery Zamolin marked a watershed in Prokhorovka scholarship because Zamolin had access to both Soviet and German archives and approached the battle without ideological investment in either side's narrative. His initial article in a Russian military history journal documented systematic inflation of German losses in Soviet reports throughout the reporting chain, company commanders, claiming 10 enemy tanks destroyed when actual number was been days. 3. battalion reports aggregating these inflated claims without verification, brigade and division reports adding their own inflation, resulting in reports reaching Stalin's desk, claiming 400 German tanks destroyed when battlefield evidence supported fewer than 80. Zamolin's documentation was meticulous, tracing specific kill claims through the reporting hierarchy and comparing them to German loss reports and post-war battlefield surveys. The article created controversy in Russian military history circles, with some older historians who had built careers on the official narrative attacking Zamolin's methodology and conclusions. The public debate at a 2005 Moscow conference on World War II history turned personal and heated when Zamolin presented his findings to an audience including several Soviet-era historians who had written the official histories he was now challenging. Colonel General Grigory Krivosheev, who had directed Soviet casualty research in the 1980s under the old system, accused Zamolin of defaming the heroism of Soviet soldiers by questioning official loss figures. Zamolin responded that documenting actual casualties honored the fallen by telling the truth about their sacrifices rather than hiding the costs behind propaganda. The exchange became heated enough that conference organizers called a recess to prevent further confrontation. The incident illustrated the emotional and political stakes in revising Prokhorovka's history for veterans and historians who had lived through the Soviet era. The official narrative wasn't just history, but part of personal and national identity that revisions threatened to undermine. The publication of Zamolin's 840-page book, Demolishing the Myth, in 2011, represented the most comprehensive account of Prokhorovka ever produced. Synthesizing Soviet and German primary sources with battlefield archaeology and veteran interviews. The book's Russian title was deliberately provocative, Srazeny pod Prokhorovkoi, Mifai I Real Nost, Demolishing the Myth and Revealing Reality. Zamolin documented hour-by-hour developments on July 12th, using both sides' combat logs, identified which specific Soviet tanks fought, which German units based on location data in archival reports, and created the most accurate casualty accounting possible, given surviving evidence. His conclusion that Prokhorovka was a Soviet tactical defeat, catastrophic losses in exchange for halting German advance, but an operational and strategic success because it contributed to stopping Citadel, challenged both the Soviet triumphalist narrative and the German narrative that portrayed the battle as a victory snatched away by Hitler's interference. The book sold poorly in Russia. Most Russians weren't interested in detailed military history that challenged comfortable narratives, but it became the definitive scholarly work on the battle internationally. The methodological challenges of establishing accurate loss figures demonstrated how difficult historical truth can be, even with access to archives. The fundamental problem was definitional. What constitutes a destroyed tank versus a damaged tank? Soviet reports often listed tanks as destroyed if they were knocked out of action during battle, even if they were later recovered and repaired. German reports distinguished between total losses and temporary combat losses, but the distinction was often meaningless because temporary losses frequently required months of repair in workshops far from the front. A Panther listed as damaged, repairable on July 12th might not return to combat operations until September, by which time it had missed the entire Kursk counteroffensive period. Should such a tank count as a loss at Prokhorovka? Historians developed different methodologies for counting, producing different totals, fueling debates that continued decades after the archives opened. The German archival advantage complicated efforts to achieve balanced accounting. Germany's military records were captured by the Allies at war's end and eventually deposited in excellent archives in Freiburg, Germany, and College Park, Maryland, where they were well preserved and accessible to researchers. Soviet records were scattered across multiple archives: Samo in Podolsk, the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, the Presidential Archive, with varying access restrictions and preservation quality. Moreover, Soviet wartime record-keeping was less systematic than German, with many documents lost to battlefield destruction, fire, or deliberate concealment of embarrassing information. The result was that historians could establish German losses at Prokhorovka with higher confidence than Soviet losses, creating asymmetry in the historical record that favored one side not because of objective reality, but because of archival survival and access. The ongoing disputes, even after archival research, revealed the limits of what archives can resolve. George Nipe, an American historian who published Decision in the Ukraine in 2000, used German archival sources to argue that German losses at Prokhorovka were lower than even revised estimates suggested, perhaps as few as 60 tanks totally destroyed. Zamelin, using Soviet sources, argued the figure was closer to 80. The 20-tank difference reflected different methodologies for categorizing marginal cases: tanks burned but potentially salvageable, tanks abandoned during withdrawals, tanks damaged on July 12 but lost in subsequent fighting when they couldn't be properly repaired. Both historians were working honestly with primary sources, yet they reached different conclusions because the sources themselves were incomplete and sometimes contradictory. The persistence of dispute despite archival access demonstrated that some historical questions might never have definitive answers. The political context of archival research influenced what could be discovered and published. During the brief openness of the early 1990s, Russian archivists were relatively willing to share sensitive documents with foreign researchers, partly from genuine commitment to historical transparency, partly from chaos, as the Soviet system collapsed and rules were unclear. By the late 1990s, Russian authorities had reasserted control and restricted access to documents that might embarrass the Russian military or challenge patriotic narratives. Documents that Glantz photographed in 1992 became unavailable to subsequent researchers in 2005 when the archive reclassified entire categories of materials. Zamelin, as a Russian citizen and former military officer, had access to documents that foreign historians couldn't see, but he also faced pressure to shape his conclusions in ways that didn't overly criticize Soviet performance. The result was that even with archives theoretically open, political factors continued to influence what history could be written. The question of why Soviet authorities concealed Prokhorovka's true costs for 50 years had multiple answers that revealed the nature of the Soviet system. At the tactical level, unit commanders inflated enemy losses and minimized their own casualties because reporting failure invited punishment, court-martial, or execution. The Soviet military culture punished bearers of bad news, creating incentives for dishonesty throughout the reporting chain. At the operational level, front and stavka commanders needed to justify casualties to Stalin, and reporting that 5,500 men died to achieve what amounted to a tactical draw wasn't politically acceptable when the narrative could be shaped as a great victory. At the strategic level, Soviet propaganda required victorious narratives to maintain public morale and international prestige, and admitting catastrophic losses undermined claims that the Red Army was defeating fascism through superior socialist organization and fighting spirit. The layered incentives for dishonesty at every level created a system where accurate information was progressively distorted as it moved up the chain, and by the time it reached historical archives, the relationship to battlefield reality was distant at best. The ongoing nature of archival research meant that understanding of Prokhorovka continued evolving into the 21st century. Archaeological excavations at the battlefield in the 2000s and 2010s discovered tank wrecks missed in earlier recovery operations, sometimes with remains of crew members still inside, providing additional data points for loss accounting. The excavations also recovered artifacts, personal effects, ammunition, equipment that helped identify which units fought in which sectors, allowing researchers to correlate archaeological evidence with archival documents. The combination of archival research, archaeology, and veteran testimony created increasingly refined understanding, though absolute certainty remained elusive. The archive wars over Prokhorovka demonstrated both the possibilities and limits of historical research. Even with unprecedented access to primary sources from both sides, some questions remained contested, and the interpretative frameworks historians brought to the evidence influenced conclusions as much as the evidence itself. What the archives undeniably revealed was that the battle both sides remembered the Soviet Great Victory or the German victory stolen by Hitler's incompetence bore limited relationship to what had actually occurred on July 12, 1943 in the wheat fields around Prokhorovka. The transformation of Prokhorovka from historical event into political mythology began within hours of the battle's conclusion, when Soviet propaganda officers began crafting the narrative that would define the battle for decades. A Pravda correspondent, who arrived at the battlefield on July 14, 1943, filed a dispatch describing the greatest tank battle in history, where heroic Soviet tankers destroyed over 400 fascist tanks and crushed the enemy's last hopes for victory on the Eastern Front. The article, published on July 16th, established narrative elements that would be repeated in thousands of subsequent accounts: the numerical exaggeration of German losses, the portrayal of the battle as decisively one-sided despite Soviet casualties, and the framing of Prokhorovka as the turning point that doomed German offensive operations. Soviet military correspondents who visited the battlefield saw the evidence contradicting the narrative they counted. The destroyed tanks spoke with survivors who described the chaos and casualties, observed the German positions that remained in German hands. But they wrote what political commissars directed them to write, creating the first layer of mythology that would eventually obscure reality so thoroughly that even participants came to remember the mythological version. The construction of Prokhorovka's mythology served multiple political functions for Stalin's regime. Domestically, the battle became evidence of Soviet military superiority and vindication of socialist organization propaganda, claimed the victory, demonstrated that Soviet workers building tanks and Soviet soldiers fighting battles could overcome capitalist exploitation represented by Nazi Germany. The casualty figures were concealed not just to hide military incompetence, but to maintain the narrative that socialism produced superior results with lower costs than capitalism. Internationally, Prokhorovka became a propaganda weapon in the contentious alliance with Britain and the United States. Stalin used accounts of massive Soviet victories to pressure the Western Allies to open a second front in France, arguing that while Soviet forces were bleeding to defeat Germany, the Americans and British were conducting marginal operations in North Africa and Italy. The mythology served Soviet foreign policy objectives by emphasizing Soviet military power and the costs the Soviet Union was bearing in the common struggle. The German counter-mythology that developed in post-war memoirs served different but equally self-serving purposes. German generals writing in the 1950s and 60s, many while seeking rehabilitation or defending their reputations, constructed a narrative in which Prokhorovka represented a near victory snatched away by Hitler's strategic incompetence. Heinz Guderian's memoir, Panzer Leader, published in 1952, described Citadel as an operation that could have succeeded if Hitler hadn't delayed it and then canceled it prematurely. Erich von Manstein's Lost Victories, published in 1958, argued that his forces were on the verge of breakthrough at Prokhorovka, when the Sicily invasion forced Hitler to transfer the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to Italy. The narrative absolved German commanders of responsibility for Citadel's failure by placing blame entirely on Hitler while portraying Wehrmacht tactical performance as exemplary. Western audiences, many predisposed to believe German generals' accounts because they opposed Soviet communism, accepted these narratives largely uncritically for decades. The 1950s through 1980s saw the solidification of dueling mythologies with minimal dialogue between them. Soviet historiography produced increasingly elaborate accounts of Prokhorovka, emphasizing heroic individual actions, party leadership's genius in planning the battle, and the decisive nature of the victory. The 1973 dedication of Prokhorovka's Bell Tower Memorial during the Leonid Brezhnev era marked the battle's elevation to sacred status in Soviet memory. Brezhnev himself attended, veterans were decorated, and the event received extensive media coverage, emphasizing continuity between World War II sacrifice and contemporary Soviet military power. German historiography focused primarily on Wehrmacht tactical excellence and Hitler's strategic blunders, largely dismissed Prokhorovka as one more example of operational art wasted by dictatorial interference. Neither narrative acknowledged the complexity of what had actually occurred, a meeting engagement where neither side achieved their objectives. Both sides suffered severe casualties, and strategic outcomes were determined as much by events in Italy as by fighting around Prokhorovka. The 1990s archival revelations created crisis for both mythologies by revealing how dramatically official narratives diverged from documentary evidence. Soviet veterans and historians who had built careers on the official narrative faced the uncomfortable reality that claims they had repeated for decades were demonstrably false. Some responded by rejecting archival evidence, arguing that their personal memories were more reliable than documents that might have been manipulated or misinterpreted. Others experienced genuine crisis of understanding. If the official account of Prokhorovka was mythology, what else about the Great Patriotic War was mythological? The psychological and political stakes were enormous, because World War II victory was the Soviet Union's founding mythology, the event that legitimized the Communist Party's rule and justified the sacrifices imposed on the population. Admitting that central narratives about the war were false threatened the entire edifice of Soviet historical memory. Post-Soviet Russia's struggle with Prokhorovka's reality revealed the difficulty of replacing comfortable mythology with complex truth in a society seeking national identity. Russian historians and educators in the 2000s faced competing pressures. Academic integrity demanded incorporating archival evidence that complicated triumphalist narratives, but political pressures from nationalist politicians and veterans organizations demanded maintaining narratives that supported Russian pride and patriotism. The compromise that emerged was a two-tier system. Scholarly works like Zamulin's book presented nuanced, evidence-based accounts for specialists, while popular media, school textbooks, and public commemorations maintained simplified narratives closer to the Soviet version. The memorial at Prokhorovka preserved its inflated casualty figures, while new interpretive materials acknowledged more accurate numbers, allowing visitors to choose which narrative to embrace. The symbolic importance of Prokhorovka transcended its tactical military significance, which is why mythology proved so resistant to correction. For the Soviet Union and later Russia, Prokhorovka represented resilience in existential struggle, the moment when Soviet forces demonstrated they could meet German armor on equal terms and prevail through determination and sacrifice. The fact that the reality was messier, that Soviet forces actually prevailed through accepting catastrophic losses that reflected serious tactical problems, didn't fit the narrative of inevitable victory through socialist superiority. For Germans, particularly those seeking to rehabilitate the Wehrmacht's reputation, Prokhorovka represented professional military excellence undermined by political interference, evidence that the German military could have won if only Hitler hadn't constantly meddled. The fact that the reality was more complicated, that German offensive doctrine was strategically bankrupt regardless of tactical success, challenged the comfortable narrative that Germany lost the war through leadership failure rather than fundamental strategic impossibility of their objectives. The contemporary relevance of Prokhorovka's mythology versus reality extended to modern military analysis and planning. Western militaries studying Soviet operational art in the 1970s and 80s based their analysis partly on Soviet accounts of Prokhorovka that emphasized deep battle theory, operational maneuver groups, and decisive armor employment. When archival research revealed that the actual battle had featured desperate close assaults, catastrophic losses, and tactical confusion, it forced reassessment of what lessons should be drawn. Was Prokhorovka an example of operational art succeeding despite tactical problems? Or was it an example of accepting unsustainable casualties to achieve objectives that could have been accomplished more efficiently? The answer mattered for contemporary military doctrine, and different militaries drew different lessons based on which aspects of the battle they chose to emphasize. The question of whether it matters if the greatest tank battle narrative is partly mythology, if the outcome German defeat was real, sparked philosophical debates among historians. Some argued that popular understanding of history is necessarily simplified, and that mythological elements in national narratives serve important social functions of promoting unity and shared identity. Others argued that historical truth matters intrinsically, and that mythology perpetuates dangerous thinking if Soviet leaders believed their own propaganda about victory at acceptable cost. They might be more willing to repeat such operations in future conflicts. The debate revealed tensions between history as academic discipline seeking truth and history as social practice serving collective memory. Prokhorovka illustrated these tensions particularly sharply because the battle's mythology had become so central to national identity, yet diverged so dramatically from documentary evidence. By the 21st century, Prokhorovka existed simultaneously in three versions that barely resembled each other. the Soviet propaganda version of decisive victory through superior organization and fighting spirit, the German memoir version of tactical success negated by strategic interference, and the archival version of a meeting engagement where Soviet forces accepted catastrophic losses to halt German advance, while German forces achieved tactical success that proved operationally and strategically meaningless. All three versions were partially true. Soviet forces did halt the German offensive, German tactical performance was superior, and strategic factors beyond the battlefield were decisive. But the mythology had obscured the reality so thoroughly that even 70 years after the battle, consensus on what actually happened and what it meant remained elusive. The myth and the reality of Prokhorovka coexisted in uncomfortable relationship, each serving different purposes, each revealing different truths about how humans remember and narrate the most traumatic events in their history.